Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. The call went out just after Patrick led Robb and Flint away to find a warm bath and fresh clothes. An emergency council meeting with full attendance was to be held immediately. No excuses. Despite being fairly tired and fighting back a headache from the trade deal talks with the men, Hermione found herself power walking toward the council chambers, the same men trailing behind her a safe distance from the towering form of Grey Wind at her side. Both Sansa and Arya met Hermione off near a T-intersection hallway in the family wing of the castle. Sansa was bleary and fighting sleep, stifling a yawn when she said, "What's going on, Lady Hermione? Why was a council called this late at night?" Hermione sighed. Lord Robb and Flint arrived just moments ago from the wall. Sansa blinked while Arya rocked on her heels, looking far too awake for past midnight. The younger girl demanded, "Is it Jon? Has something happened with the wildlings?" "In a manner of speaking," replied Hermione tersely. The two princesses shared a look, but fell into step with Hermione. It took some time, but when they arrived at the war room, it was nearly full with many sleepy lords and representatives. It took some time, but soon order was called. "Lord Flint," began Arya, glancing at Sansa and Hermione, both who nodded. "What news?" The young man repeated what he told Hermione and those who were with her, to the growing speechlessness of the others. There was some disquiet which turned into grumbles. Soon, there was shouting. "What does it matter to us?" one lord shouted. "Who cares about what happens north of the wall? That's what the wall is for," protested another. "It should damn well matter," bellowed the Grey Jon, slamming a fist on the table and shaking it, "since those wildlings could break through and make it south." Another lord scoffed openly, and Hermione watched with wide eyes as chaos, as it never had happened before, descended on the council. "We need to fight," argued Stark, his voice rising above the others. "We must fight." Someone shouted back at him, their words garbled and lost as others began side conversations or shouting matches. "I don't believe this," thought Hermione, turning to stare incredulously at Sansa, whose face was a stoic mask despite the annoyance her slightly downturned mouth showed, and Arya, who was gaping widely at everyone. "Enough," shouted Hermione, standing from her seat, and making her wand boom loudly. The noise echoed like a gunshot had gone off, making Brienne, behind Sansa, reflexively duck on her knees. She sent a sour look at Hermione. The noise also caught the attention of those in the room, and those who had been speaking fell silent. "That's enough," repeated Hermione, taking the time to keep her voice even and to look and meet those who looked back at her. "Arguing does us nothing. The whole point of the wall is, and please correct me if my education on the finer points of your history is wrong, to defend your lands against threats. Whether these threats are wildlings or," she caught Bolton's eyes, who glanced away. "Others." There was a collective indrawn suck of air by the lords in the room. "We must stand together. There is no harm in following up on what Lord Flint has seen, nor what Lady Mormont has written." "But what of the ice boxes? The trade agreement with the Free Cities?" moaned one lord. "We can't just abandon those." "Who said we would?" asked Hermione rhetorically with a shrug of her shoulders. "Not everyone has to go to the wall, you know? The wonderful thing about this council and our communication parchments is that we can continue to make decisions together even when physically separate. I'd suggest we have two trustworthy lords remain at Winterfell with Princess Arya and Princess Sansa, and that a host continues to the wall. "Second," shouted Blackwood, immediately rapping on the table to indicate his support. "Third," agreed a lesser lord, and soon a vote was tallied. "Who will remain?" asked Stark, looking around the room. Although it's never stated, there was an inner circle that Hermione considered her closest allies, and from there, those who spent the majority of their time around the two Stark princesses. "Lord Serwyn has already begun to tackle the shipment and organization of everything," said Hermione, turning to look at the man halfway around the table. "Your organizational skills will come in handy, I think. And as a man of the North, and from a seat near Winterfell, you can be trusted to run things." Sansa nodded along with Hermione. "And I would recommend a river lord, Lord Mollister. His experience with his ships and shipping routes will help the trade agreements and negotiations alongside Lord Manderley." The votes were cast and agreed. From there, it was down to details of supply trains, resources, and when they would leave. "It shouldn't be too long," said Arya, glancing out of the window, despite not being able to see anything in the darkness. "The days are getting shorter, and winter will be here soon enough." "Agreed," said Umber. "No more than 2 weeks' time, I should think. That'll be enough to get provisions." And enough time to attempt new training with the new structure for our host, agreed Bracken with a bloodthirsty smile. Think your boy can handle it, Blackwood? The larger bearded man met his old rival's smile with a toothy one of his own. Aye, my boy can handle anything thrown his way. Good, then it's settled, said Hermione, glancing at Arya, who nodded back. 2 weeks' time, we head north to see what's going on. A Castle Black. As the lords filtered out, some to get an early start to their day. Arya reached forward and tugged on Hermione's sleeve until the older witch leaned toward the younger girl. What is it, Arya?
Do you think John's gonna be okay? She whispered, conscious of anyone lingering behind. Flint didn't say anything about him.
Hermione bit her lip and glanced away. I don't know, but you'll find out, won't you? When she looked back at the younger girl, Hermione nodded and her voice was fierce when she said, I lost one Stark. I won't lose you another. I can promise you that. I'll do whatever I can to help him. A tingle of something made Hermione shiver. Good, replied Arya. But Hermione wasn't listening. Instead, she had her thoughts turned inward, feeling around her magic and wondering what caused the strange sensation, until she realized that she had sworn a vow. Horror stole over her, and she beat a hasty retreat from the council. Hopefully whatever it took to help John at the wall wasn't going to kill her with her vague vow, and that it was something she could morally agree with. And in Westeros, she thought with a twist to her lips, you never knew which way people leaned on the moral spectrum. Preparations were going smoothly as far as Hermione could tell. Despite the weariness that had settled on her shoulders, the lack of sleep resulting in persistent fatigue, or the dullness in her eyes, Hermione stepped up to lead the Northerners and aid them with her magic, the one thing that wasn't faltering. Blackwood and Bracken were in charge of the wood shipments, with Mallister cataloging and dividing the materials across several oxen and carts. The Great John had stepped up as well, taking Hermione's suggestions to oversee their food rations, directing everything into mini-packs for the soldiers, as well as larger quantities to bring to the wall in what could be a long siege. Everything has been prepared as you want. Hermione blinked a few times to wake herself up and pay attention to Rose Bolton and his soft voice. I and the others you selected, with Princess Sansa's help, have been organizing the men into commands and units. I must say that I find this ordering superior and easier to handle than the large number of men usually found under our command, separated by skill or designated role. Hermione nodded, glancing to the side of the large Great Hall doors that led to the inner courtyard, and at 2 Winterfell guards on either side of the doors. They immediately sprang to attention, heaving back the heavy wooden beam that served as a barrier and lock, shifting and sliding the wood against the iron hooks until they could swing the doors open. A blast of cold air brushed against Hermione, and she flicked her hand at herself. Bolton and Patrick and Lucas covering the 4 with a non-verbal warming charm. Bolton nodded his thanks, while the 2 men behind her murmured their appreciation. Outside, the courtyard was a busy hive with people moving back and forth. There were empty carts that rolled into the courtyard and left full of material, people rushing back and forward, carrying orders or shouting commands, even washerwomen or seamstresses chasing after soldiers and men to sew patches or insignias onto their armor, each patch imbued with the magical portkey sigil to ensure they were not accidentally lost. We'll need to leave shortly, replied Hermione, eyes moving across the courtyard. Probably within the next day or so. Yes, of course. Hermione stiffened, something beyond the cold forcing a shiver down her spine. It was her magic tingling out a warning or a nudge for her to pay attention. Milady? Patrick asked. From behind, Hermione heard his feet shift on the snow-covered flagstone and heard the heavy plates of his armor shift against one another as he moved. Hermione could imagine that he had his hand on the hilt of his sword, looking around the courtyard for the implied danger.
Frowning, Hermione's eyes slowly moved across the space, not lingering on anyone until just off to her right at a blank space of snow. There was something fuzzy, just out reach for her, and she narrowed her eyes.
But a blast of cold air blew up a cloud of snow, and the fuzziness was gone. Although something lingered, Hermione shook her head, turning to face both Patrick and Lucas. It's fine. It's nothing. Patrick's gaze was narrowed, but they moved again down the steps and towards the Great John. However, the uneasy feeling lingered in Hermione's mind as they gathered their supplies, ready to head out shortly for the wall. There was much to do and instructions to be carried out by Soreen and Mallister, both who were staying behind in Winterfell to organize the ongoing trade with the Free Cities for their ice boxes. Both were keeping correspondence steady with news in the Riverlands and elsewhere, while the majority of the Northern and Riverlands forces were going to head north at a snail's pace. With the day of departure creeping steadily on them, Hermione decided to take a break from her nerves and soothe her tense back. Her shoulders had been creeping up as the days continued, to the point that Barbara had commented on the tenseness in her shoulders when she had brushed the brown-haired woman's unruly hair. "A bath would do you well, milady," the young woman commented. "You need your rest." Hermione surveyed herself in the mirror. She purloined from her tent to prop up on a vanity in the room she was using in Winterfell. "Do I look that bad?" Horrified, Barbara sputtered. "My lady, no. Lady Hermione, not at all." "Sorry, Bar," replied Hermione, meeting the woman's brown eyes in the mirror. "I was just teasing. I know I'm tired." She was organizing and effectively co-ruling with Arya, although Hermione certainly didn't see it that way, despite others who did. Left its mark, Hermione was tired. She sustained herself on her magic and pure stubbornness, eager to tell her guards to get a rest and eat, but often neglecting herself. She was beginning to feel like she had in her 3rd year. "Oh, who am I kidding?" thought Hermione with a sigh. "This is exactly like 3rd year, but I can't blame my exhaustion on a time turn." "A bath would be lovely," said Hermione instead, turning a smile on Barbara, who curtsied and quickly backed out from the room to call for some servants. Hermione grimaced and hid her face. That was one thing she still hadn't got used to, the way Robb's guard followed her, how Barbara catered to her as her lady-in-waiting, the use of servants. It felt too much like using house elves and laziness when Hermione could easily make do herself, especially conjuring water for a bath with agouti and a heating charm. But she endured the women, carrying their buckets of piping hot water from a nearby hot water source, most likely pushed up from ancient pipes in the wall until they left, carrying her soiled clothes for a wash. Barbara had set out her pajamas, at first exclaiming at the indecency of sleeping in trousers and a shirt, but soon learned that Hermione's stare was an equal weight of judgment. Hermione piled her hair on top of her head, disrobed, and then eased into the water, thinking back that one of the last few times she had a chance to enjoy a bath, that wasn't for necessity of keeping clean, was when she and Daisy had their scar trade-off. Her lips quirked into a smile at the memory, but then soon faded. "I owe you," she thought, staring into the steaming water. "I owe it to your family to find out what happened to you. No matter how scared I am to learn that you're dead. Or, worse, you're alive and I left you these long months to be tortured by someone." She leaned back and closed her eyes, slowly sinking down until her chin just rested above the water. She was lulling into a light doze when her mirror charmed to vibrate, when someone was calling her activated. Frowning, Hermione opened a single eye and glared at the device. Anyone else in the castle would either come to the door, and then Ed or Donnell, or guards for the evening, would come in pointedly, not look at her, and tell her what they wanted. The only people who might use the mirror would be Sansa or Arya. Concerned, Hermione reached one dripping hand toward the mirror and summoned it, thinking Accio strongly as the silver flew across the room and into her hand. She tilted it enough so she was still covered and activated the mirror, and nearly dropped it in the water. Robb Stark stared at her, and her heart leaped into her throat, her tongue sticking to the roof of her mouth. Her eyes widened and took in his appearance. He had a layer of scruff on his cheeks and chin, a darker red to his hair, and his blue eyes were clear and wide as they surveyed her. And strangely, he was wearing a Weasley jumper. "Robb!" His name burst from her mouth, and water sloshed as she tried to sit up in the tub, but slipped. Then the mirror clouded, and the connection dimmed. Hermione held her breath for a moment, and then, voice wavering, she tentatively called, "Robb? Robb Stark?" But the mirror remained blank, and Hermione carefully placed the mirror on a nearby towel before sinking below the waterline, if only to hide the tear tracks on her face. 10 months. 10 months with nothing but a nearly broken mirror, the beginning of what Madame Pomfrey called an ulcer, a raging temper, and nothing to show. He had been stuck in Hermione's world for 9 months, and those assigned to help him return to his world, to Westeros, were about as far along as they had been when he first arrived. Rubbing the heels of his hands against his tired eyes, and hunched as he collapsed down on the chair in his new room. It was beautiful, he could admit that, but so far, everything at Hogwarts had an ethereal beauty to it. Things were clean. The lines and materials for furniture crisp and modern in ways that his rough homespun equivalents weren't. But each glance at chrome, at the callous use of copper for decoration of all eyes, made Robb cringe just a bit more. It wasn't Harry's fault. Hermione's best friend had slowly become a better friend to him as well, and the idea of moving their research from Grimmauld Place to Hogwarts was a welcome one. With the school over for the session, they were able to move around freely without anyone questioning him or his friendliness with war heroes, and access the library as well as the many portraits. Instead of being in the library with the others, Robb was having a proper sulk. The longer he remained away from Westeros, the worse his feelings became toward his ultimate return. Whatever brought him here, or was keeping him from returning, he felt like it was the gods laughing at him for being such a failure as a king. If I ever get home, I promise I'll do better, he vowed fiercely, playing with one of the daggers he had on his body when he arrived in Britain. He flopped the flat of the knife back and forth on the arm of the chair, his mind wandering and eyes lingering on his discarded message mirror on a nearby coffee table. The etched runes hadn't worked 7 months ago, and he was sure they wouldn't now, but that didn't stop him from periodically trying. He reached for it, propped the mirror up open in his hand, and said quietly, "Hermione Granger." The mirror fogged up. Robb's breath caught, and he sat upright. A connection? "Hermione?" he called, handshaking. The fog in the mirror swirled until it cleared, and for a brief moment he saw Hermione's face. It was pale, with dark smudges under her eyes, and her hair was piled on top of her head, with wet ringlets and curls either frizzing from humidity or hanging wetly against her neck. Beads of water rolled down her neck, and his eyes followed the trail until the edge of the mirror, where he spied a hint of cleavage from a naked chest. She's in the bath. His breath caught and his eyes flew up to hers. They were wide and her mouth had dropped open, her mouth forming his name, but then all he saw was his reflection. "No!" Robb's hands shook and he clutched the mirror with both as he stood from his chair, fiercely staring down at the mirror, shouting repeatedly, "Hermione Granger! Hermione Granger!" That was how Harry found him, hours later hoarsely saying Hermione's name in a broken, scratchy voice. "Let's go through things again," suggested Luna, her voice cheery despite the resounding groans from everyone else around her. "Must we?" asked Ron, bringing his head down and forward onto the table with a funk. "I have to agree with Ron, Luna," said Harry, rubbing his eyes underneath his glasses. "We're at the end of our ropes, here." Robb's gut churned. Earlier, when Harry had found him, the king had excitedly recalled the mirror working for a brief moment. The wizard had been ecstatic and quickly sent a Patronus message to everyone to meet, and that had been several hours ago. The moon had very quickly risen and now hung in the night sky, illuminating the tiny corner of the library where several witches, wizards, and one king sat. Their table was covered in books, some open, some in haphazard piles, scrolls and rolls of parchments. Many with fresh ink on them lay drying between Luna, Professor Flitwick, and Bill Weasley. Ron and Harry were on one end with Robb, while the others were opposite them. In between were McGonagall and Fleur as well as George. George's hair was mussed and standing up on ends from the numerous times he had run his hands through the orange locks. "I still can't explain it," sighed Bill, his scars from grayback in relief against his worn face. "It was an anomaly, Luna, and starting the equations over—" "No," the blonde said, shaking her head and letting her radish earrings hit her cheeks. "Let's go back to the beginning. When Robb first arrived," the group stared back at her. "But we all know what happened," moaned Ron. "Why do we need to listen to this again?" "I think we're missing something," replied Luna, a slight frown on her face. "Remember when he dreamwalked? He saw Hermione. Professor Finenzi mentioned his gods were watching, and he ended up at the weirwood tree. The trees were the connection. The woods. Wood is part of the earth." Fleur had a strange look on her face. "You think the forest is the method of travel?" Robb sat up straight in his seat, pushing against hope. "No." Robb sighed and slumped in his seat. "I think it's part of it." Harry's face was scrunched up in confusion. "Luna, you're gonna need to explain. There was a fight, a battle?" she asked, turning to Robb to face him directly. The king nodded, slowly. "My men were massacred at the Twins under a peace talk." Those around the table in the library were all survivors and veterans of Voldemort's war and campaign against them. The shuddering of their faces spoke volumes of their own thoughts of what a massacre meant. Luna nodded in reply. "So blood. Sweat," said Fleur, in a voice of dawning understanding. "Both are water-based." Flitwick leaned back in his seat, and Robb could tell he was refraining himself from clapping jovially. "Air from the distance of space of the Portkey travel. Earth, the woods," continued Bill, his own eyes wide and voice low. Harry felt like he was missing something as the other purebloods around the table seemed to cotton on to what was going on. Even Ron had perked up at the table, a thoughtful frown on his face. But what about fire? Everyone had a look of confusion about them until Luna spoke next. It was winter, where you are from, correct? Robb blinked. Yes. What was the month? Month? Robb looked blankly around. He remembered Hermione once complaining that he and the Westerosi used moons to count time, whereas she used months. He rolled his eyes up the ceiling as he tried to find a way to translate, mentally counting back to the date of the massacre. Autumn had a firm grip in the north. With snow and frost, the twins had been cold. He remembered the freezing rain that had come down the week prior to the attack, and the heavy fog, but when seasons could last years, there was no point in counting months the same way. Well, it was a nice moon, he began haltingly. Flitwick beamed. The 1st of February. At the blank look Ron and Harry sported, the half-goblin professor explained, an ice moon is another name for the first full moon in January or February, and if we go under the assumption that it was approximately the 1st of February, continued Bill, his voice rising in excitement, then it would also fall under Bulb. With Luna finishing, also known as St. Brigid's Festival Day, the goddess of fire. Luna smiled brightly, adding, among other things, thus bringing full circle, earth, water, air, and fire. There was a moment of breathless accomplishment by several of those around the table, but the look of confusion between Harry and Robb did not lessen their confusion. What? Asked Harry dumbly. McGonagall sighed, because Potter's all 4 elements. If I understand Miss Lovegood correctly here, if we replicate that, then King Robb may return home. Elation burst through Robb at the words. Much of that is easily replicated, agreed Flitwick, nearly vibrating. A small cut for the blood. The air is in abundance in the magic here at Hogwarts, and we have the Forbidden Forest, where he was found. The date is slightly problematic. No, it's not, retorted Luna. Head swung to face her, and she serenely smiled back. Tomorrow is midsummer, a day where we light bonfires. Fire, breathed Harry, eyes wide behind his glasses. He then turned to Robb, who, equally shocked and wide-eyed, staring at everyone around the table before leaping to his feet. Thank you, he said, his voice low and feverish, as he looked everyone at the table in the eye. Thank you. There wasn't time for a feast. As soon as they figured it out, Robb had raced back to his rooms and began throwing things into the expanded satchel Bill Weasley had given him, not caring at the mess he made as he rolled a shirt into a ball. There would be time to iron out wrinkles when he was back home. But it was hard watching the odds and ends he had collected over the past 10 months vanish. His clothes from the wardrobe went first. All the jumpers and jeans he had been given by the Weasleys and Harry, including what he wore that day as he quickly changed into the homespun linens and cottons of his Westerosian northern heritage. Then it was the books he had read, bought from Waterstones or given to him from Ginny, the extra copies the heroes of Hogwarts owned of their past and deeds. The moving images on the covers scowled as they were shoved into the darkness of the satchel, the pages flapping, unhappy at their rough handling. Then, toiletries, with a few trips made back and forth between the room and suite as Robb always remembered that one last thing, until he had to call for a house elf to help. With a snap of its fingers, his room was devoid of personality and was as bare as it was when he first took possession. He was standing in the middle, vaguely feeling like he was forgetting something, when Harry entered with a soft knock on the portrait frame. The black-haired man whistled as he entered. Does this place ever look different? Robb turned. I keep thinking I'm forgetting something, but I've packed it all. How strange is that? Harry shook his head. It sounds perfectly normal to me. He looked around the room again. Anyway, a few of us want to say goodbye. I know you said no dinner, but maybe you'll indulge us. Sighing, Robb hoisted the satchel up and over his head, slinging the bag across his body. The leather crisscrossed with his bracers and came to a rest on the hip opposite his empty sword scabbard. The walk through Hogwarts halls was bittersweet. Some portraits called out goodbyes and good lucks. Others followed them from landscape to portrait to tapestry, shouting last-minute advice that Robb couldn't use. And don't forget the helpful swish and flick for you decapitation spell, Your Highness. You made a lot of friends, commented Harry with a small smile on his face. Something I never thought possible of a portrait, replied Robb wryly. Yeah, they do grow on you. They fell silent until they arrived at the Great Hall. It was late for a dinner, nearly midnight, but the faculty at Hogwarts had rallied together, and many of the members of the Order of the Phoenix who had helped him in some capacity or another were there. Some, like Kingsley, wide-eyed from their late-night jobs, while others, such as Neville Longbottom, were bleary-eyed from being woken. Robb couldn't remember the details of that feast, just that there were many well wishes, words to pass on to Hermione when they met up, and helpful advice and encouragement for his own rule. Then he was standing outside, looking back at the castle in the darkness as its lights flickered and it became swallowed up by the gloom, as he and Harry, his guide, walked toward the Forbidden Forest. Both Harry and Robb were quiet as they left Hogwarts. Robb was concentrating on picturing Winterfell and his home in his head, consolidating the very essence of home, the way that Professor Farrens instructed Harry, for all Robb knew, was contemplating an aura report for work with the frown and furrow between his brows. The days were long and sunny, and that evening remained pleasant, but not humid. Some birds were still chirping, and there was a pleasant scent from the nearby flower bushes, hidden in the dark by sight but not smell. The grass was springy as they stepped off the path and headed towards Hagrid's hut, but then they detoured around it and his garden patch. Yet the moment they stepped up to the edge of the Forbidden Forest, there was a chill, and the cheerful chirps from the nearby birds were silenced. Robb shivered, but took a deep breath and took a few steps forward into the near pitch-black forest along the dirt path before him. After a few steps, he realized Harry had stopped. "Harry?" he asked, turning. His voice was slow, hesitant, as his brows furrowed and the leathers of his original jerkin shifted and creaked under his steel armor. "Aren't you coming?" Still, at the edge of the forest, Harry offered Robb a smile, but it was sad, resigned. He put his hands into the pockets of his robes and shook his head. "No, sorry, Robb, but I'm not going with you." Robb's breath froze in his chest, a physical blow, and he stumbled. I beg your pardon." "I'm not going with you to Westeros, Robb," repeated Harry, his voice gentle. "I'm sorry I'm only telling you this now, but I can't go." But, Robb covered the distance he traveled into the forest and stood an arm's length from Harry. "But what about Hermione? Or helping me with my kingdom? The North?" "You don't need me to help you be a good king," laughed Harry, as if Robb was a child who said something ridiculously silly and obvious. His voice was kind, though. "You're brilliant on your own, and you don't need another magical user. You have Hermione. She's worth 10 of me, I'm sure." "But it's Hermione, Harry," argued Robb, dropping his own voice, a frown on his face. Don't you want to see her again?" "Oh, I'll see her again," the black-haired man replied with conviction. "But not like this. This is your journey, Robb. You came here for a reason." "Some reason," the king muttered under his breath. "I've been in Britain for 10 months, Harry, away from everything I ever knew. What did I learn?" The look Harry sent him was slightly patronizing. Robb, the other man sighed, turning his face away and running a hand through his hair, messing it up. The waves were thick, covered in some product Fleur had lent him some time ago. He grimaced at the feel. "What have I learned? Being here," he wondered petulantly, "other than how alien this world is to mine." But he knew that was unfair. Robb had learned quite a lot, and he had to admit it to himself, with a sigh as he glanced at Harry, who had a knowing glint in his emerald eyes. "Fine," the other man replied, a tiny pout on his lips. "I did learn a lot from being here." Robb resisted a growl or to reach out and shake Harry. But he did speak, although with a dry tone that was of one repeating memorized facts. "I learned about Hermione. I learned about you and Weasley and the Battle of Hogwarts. I learned a lot about magic and spellcrafting and rules and limitations. I learned about technology and the future, and about great heroes and leaders in trying times." Harry smiled. "Anything else?" "I learned I can trust myself to make decisions," sighed Robb, a small answering smile coming to his face now. "That even when I'm put in a strange, unfamiliar place, I am strong and capable enough to adapt and survive." "Important things to be sure," replied Harry with a laugh. "Being thrust into a strange new world could break anyone's mind and soul." Robb nodded and said quietly, "It's a wonder Hermione didn't just curse us all when we wandered into the clearing that day we met. She could have just as easily bound us and wiped our memories, but she didn't." Who knows why she did or didn't do it, replied Harry, even if the statute would allow it, but it probably had something to do with her experiences with her parents. Robb winced in sympathy. They won't ever. Harry shook his head. No, they won't ever remember her. They'll live their lives out as Wendell and Monica Wilkins, a constant reminder and gash on Hermione's soul that magic can't solve everything. And even worse, that magic can be twisted and has a mind of its own. The two men were silent a moment longer, with Robb slowly bringing his eyes back around and forward to the darkened forest ahead of him. So I just walk, is that it? He asked quietly. Harry nodded, taking a step forward so he was level with Robb. You just walk forward, and if Luna and Firenze are right about everything, which they are, you'll find yourself home in Westeros. Just like that? Just like that, confirmed Harry. Robb frowned. He said skeptically, I don't know if I can trust magic like that. We don't even know what caused the Portkey to yank me here, to begin with, and now we're trust tree magic and a set of circumstances to return me. The only link between Westeros and here, and your experiences in your dreams, are trees. You worship your gods by trees. Robb reminded Harry, what harm is there in trying? If there's one thing I learned, is that magic doesn't follow the rules. Besides, you have that flair George made for you if you don't find yourself back in Westeros before your rations run out. We'll come to get you, and we'll try again. Robb sighed. They fell silent again until Harry said tentatively, It's not easy, is it? Walking through the forest to your destiny. Robb huffed a laugh. No, it's not. It was hard when I did it too. Robb turned to look at Harry quizzically. Harry caught the look, and there was a pained expression in his smile, one that was equally parts resignation and remembrance. I died in the forest. What? Robb's eyes widened. Harry caught the look and laughed a little. It was during the Battle of Hogwarts. Ron, Hermione, and I kept this part from the books so that no one knew how close we came to failing. But I just learned I was a Horcrux, and Dumbledore's entire plan was for me to sacrifice myself, so that the soul sharing my body would be the target of the killing curse. Once that Horcrux was gone, I'd be free to kill Voldemort. That was risky, replied Robb, eventually, mulling over the idea of sending a close friend of his to their death on a gamble. Could he have done it? Send Sansa, or Arya, or Bran, or even Rickon, or Jon out into the Wolfswood on a gamble that a part of them had to die to be reborn, or successful. Wasn't that what the Targaryens had tried with Summerhall and rebirthing their dragons only to fail? It was incredibly risky, but I did it anyway. I walked by myself down this path to a clearing further into the forest, and let Voldemort point his wand at me and kill me, said Harry. Dying was easy, Robb. So easy. It was like going to sleep and waking up somewhere else and being told I had a choice. He turned to face Robb fully. I made a choice. I didn't have to make it, to return. Neville could have finished of Nagini and the others could have killed Voldemort without me. Not easily, but they could have. He shook his head. Being a hero, their hero, meant making tough decisions. It meant going back and continuing to fight. It was being brave in the face of the unknown. That it is, said the king softly. Exactly, nodded Harry, bringing his wand out from his pocket and making a swishing movement between the two men. As he did so, the wand traced a shape in the air, the outline of which glowed a brilliant gold and white. And with that being said, it's time for this to be given to someone who is brave of heart. Robb watched, eyes growing wide as the glow disappeared, and a broadsword, similar in length and style to his father's ice, hung suspended in the air between the two men. The sheen from the gold hilt bounced off the little beams of light that punctured through the dense canopy of the trees around them, and the silver-honed hue of the steel glimmering and almost blue. Harry, this, Robb, is Godric Gryffindor's blade. It's goblin-made, excellent quality, and its steel is covered with the deadliest poison from our world, explained Harry, reaching out and gripping the hilt. The blade shimmered a moment and then shrunk to fit Harry's hand and frame, going from a broadsword to a bastard blade. Harry experimentally swung it a few times. Only the bravest and truest of men can wield it. You used this kill the basilisk when you were 12, said Robb, remembering the story Ginny told him. Harry nodded, bringing the sword to rest so that the tip was pointed at the ground. It served me well then, but it's time it went to a new home. A new home? Echoed Robb, confusedly. Harry grinned and handed the sword to him. Robb fumbled with the hilt for a moment, and then swung it up and around as his grip changed, the hilt growing wider and thicker, and the blade growing longer until it was shaped exactly like ice. Even the steel shimmered and turned a whitish silver that complemented the gold of the hilt. "It's yours now," said Harry, clapping Robb on the shoulder as he did so. Robb stared at him in befuddlement. "Besides, what use do we wizards have for a broadsword in the 21st century? Wands are definitely an elegant weapon for a more civilized age."
So, Harry, I can't take this, stuttered Robb.
"Sure you can, just like so," argued Harry pleasantly, rocking a bit on his heels in pleasure. "It's yours. You need it more than we do, and maybe this will give you the edge you need in a battle with your enemies." "Thank you," breathed Robb, blinking rapidly to hide the sheen in them. "You've been a true friend. Why can't you come? Your wisdom and help would mean so much." "You don't need me, Robb," explained Harry, stepping back, closer to Hogwarts and away from the forest. "Besides, I was the hero of the story once before. I did my duty then, and while I didn't completely hang up that title and mantle, being an aura, I have responsibilities and duties here that I can't abandon. I can't rush off into danger anymore. But, Robb, if you need us, I promise you I will come," said Harry, his eyes fixed firmly on his friend. "But right now, you need to go back. Hermione's been alone too long. She needs you too." Robb squeezed his eyes shut, turning his back on Harry. It was painful, and it was hard to acknowledge he had grown close and dependent on his friend in this realm. But he also knew he couldn't stay. Harry's words of responsibility and duty reminded him he was a king, and his people needed him. He could appreciate and understand that if anything. Without turning, Robb nodded once and said loudly, "Thank you, Harry." He clutched at the sword and then expertly sheathed it in his empty scabbard. The sword fit perfectly. He then began a purposeful stride forward. Never once, looking back, he knew Harry remained where he was, eyes on his back, until Robb disappeared into the thick forest, because it was some time before that knowing itch of someone watching him went away, if at all. There was something strange about the Forbidden Forest, its wide trees and the low hum of barks and croaks of creatures. Soon the dirt path he had begun his journey on disappeared. Left floundering for a moment, Robb looked left and then right and then shrugged. He continued forward off the path on a new path of his own decision, and with the knowledge that eventually he should return home. It took him several hours, much longer than he had expected, when the sun went down and the summer chill of the forest turned autumn-like, his breaths coming out in misty pants, that Robb realized that the trees were no longer the same as the start of his journey. He paused and turned in a circle, looking up. Gone were the pine trees and green pointed leaves of the trees in the Forbidden Forest. These trees around him were thicker in their trunks, moss-covered, and the leaves a silvery green color that would seem strange for others, but was welcoming for him. Home, he thought, nearly dropping the sword of Gryffindor to reach into the magically expanded bag and withdraw the mirror Hermione had enchanted for him over a year ago. His hands shook as he pulled it out, and his voice cracked when he stated, "Hermione Granger." The glass of the mirror went foggy. Yes, he thought, wanting to pump his fist in the air in triumph like he saw Ginny do once at a Quidditch match. There's a connection, but no one answered. Robb frowned. Arya Stark, Sansa Stark, desperately at each name, not connecting despite the foggy interior. Robb began naming others. Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, Torrin Karstark, Daisy Mormont. Baffled, he stared down at the mirror, flipping it over to inspect the runes that Bill Fleur and Professor Flitwick had etched into it. Thoughtfully, he hummed under his breath, and then looked up and around at the silent forest around him. A bird chirped in the distance, and a loud caw from a raven above him had him look up. Startled, the black bird seemed to inspect him as well, thoroughly, before flapping its wings in agitation. It shook itself, and then peered beadily at him. Caw! Wait, what? Robb looked from the raven to the forest, and then back to his mirror. With that avenue shut, he found himself floundering. I returned to Westeros, but I have no idea where I am. How am I supposed to make it back to the northern camp? Where are they? Coy! The raven reprimanded him in an odd cough, and he jumped, looking up at it. It flew from its branch to another, almost jerking its beak at him as it cawed again, loudly and for a prolonged moment, as it stretched its vocal sound. Key! Robb stared at the raven blankly, and it stared back at him. After a long moment, he leaned forward and asked it, almost seriously, Are you a wizard shapeshifter? The raven ruffled its feathers and gave Robb a very imperious look. Key, he intoned again, in its strange caw. Key, repeated Robb quietly, frowning. Key? He paused. My gods, port key. I have a port key. I can get to Winterfell. With a bright grin, he looked back at the raven to thank it. Having spent nearly a year in the wizarding world of Hermione and Harry's, he wasn't averse to such strange things anymore. But the raven flew off, disappearing into the thick leaves of the trees above him. His hand came up to the wolf's brooch he had pinned to his cloak, fingering the delicate work Gendry had put into his design. The snarling wolf, his family's sigil, was comfort, and he imagined he could feel it pulse with Hermione's magic. Gryffindor, he said. After so much time at Grimmauld Place and Hogwarts, Robb could recognize the feel of magic, and here, after speaking the password, it enveloped him just as the anchor hooked him from his navel and sent him spinning through space and across a large distance, depositing him hard on solid frozen ground in the clearing by the ruined tower. Huffing a breath, Robb stood to his full height, mentally cataloging that he hadn't left anything behind. Even the sword was still clutched tightly in his right hand. Then he peered around and saw the markings of several fire pits and tent poles that scourged the ground. But the area was abandoned, covered with fresh, undisturbed snow. No one had been at the tower for some time. With a slightly disappointed sigh, Robb thought, well, I'll have a trek to make, but at least Winterfell isn't far. Tilting his head up slightly, he turned in a slow circle until he faced approximately east. In the distance, there were faint clouds, or clustered smoke, and knew he had a direct bearing. One foot stepped forward, and then the next, and soon he had an easy stride propelling him forward through the dense forest, his boots crunching on the snow. The sun met its zenith, and then began slowly to swoop down as it fell behind Robb. Its long rays struggled to reach over the tops of the trees in the Wolf's Wood as Robb breached the tree line, coming upon the furthest edges of Torrens Square between the town and the road that led to Winterfell. The road itself was repaired, altered from the dirt path it had been with deep furrows from carts and hooves, to an actual stone road with an unnaturally smooth surface that only magic could have made. There were a few heading into Torrens Square from Winterfell, mainly with empty carts, and Robb halted one as they passed. You, he called, jogging a few steps forward to catch the man's attention. Where are you coming from? The common folk looked Robb up and down, a faint look of surprise on his face as he surveyed the man, taking in his clean appearance. The haggard man replied, From Winterfell, me lord. What for? What is it that you do? Asked Robb curiously. It's for the wood that Lord Umber asked for, the man replied, blinking, to repair the damage done at Winterfell. Others, the man then nodded at a cart several yards ahead of him, continuing on its way, were collecting ice and bringing it to Torrens Square for collection. Ice? Echoed Robb. Aye, my lord, the man said, now looking at him in suspicion. Where have you been? If you don't mind my asking. Everyone around here knows that the Lord's Council is making money off of selling ice to them, southerners, and preparing to go north to the wall. Why? I've ever heard that old buildings are being rebuilt. Robb stared at the man, agog. I've been a while, for some time, I'll say. The two stared at each other for a moment longer before Robb skillfully and deftly pulled out a few copper pieces that he had on him from before the massacre at the Twins. For your time, thank you. The man took the coins and nodded, turning back and pulling on his cart as he continued down the smooth road. By the time the sun had fully set, Robb could see the outline of Winterfell ahead, torches flickering like beacons from multiple points along the battlements. He was weary, not quite exhausted, but worn down by the time he reached the gates where several Stark bannermen stood at attention. Their eyes were alert, something he hadn't expected from his own previous experience of men-at-arms, who were often tired after standing still for so long, and nearly stumbled into one when the guard stepped forward and called, "Halt!" Robb squared his shoulders. "Who goes?" the guard called, reaching back for a torch that the other guard passed forward to better see the young redhead. "Robb Stark of Winterfell," said Robb, his voice hoarse but loud. "King in the north. Now let me through." The guard who stepped forward held a torch up, his mouth dropping open. My lord." He cleared his throat and bowed at the waist. "Lo, your grace. Lady Hermione had placed a spell to keep your disappearance quiet, but now that you're here, and we can speak of you." The other guard bowed, and Robb nodded at them both. "I'll learn more about this shortly, I'm sure. But for now, I'd like to enter." Of course, Your Grace. The first guard agreed, quickly rising and knocking on the gate. From the other side, the lever cranked and the heavy doors opened slowly, revealing a lightly lit courtyard. Shall we announce you, Your Grace? The second guard asked, eagerly. Robb shook his head. No, thank you. Your Grace. The king turned around, a weary look on his face, but the guard, a younger man, maybe only a few years older than him, swallowed and said, his lips twitching as he tried a nervous smile, I'm glad you've returned. Robb felt his own lips turn up and a small smile in response. Thank you. The two guards bowed again, and the doors creaked shut behind him. Robb stepped forward, out from under the thick tunnel that separated the exterior wall and exterior courtyard and stables. Inside, many people who moved in the cold air paused as he began walking familiar paths. On either side, mouths dropped open, and he could hear the excited and surprised murmurs as people recognized him and began repeating the same things repeatedly. It's the king. It's King Robb. He's returned. He's back. Slowly, a crowd found itself forming behind him as he pushed past the stables, and then under another wall, the two guards on the outside of that hastily and quickly throwing the doors open. He nodded his thanks, striding forward and picking up speed until he was in the inner courtyard, near the entrance to the great hall. Your Grace? A startled voice said from off to his side, and Robb glanced to see Lord Serwyn staring at him. Your Grace? The man's voice carried through the suddenly quiet courtyard, and Robb let his gaze carefully travel over familiar faces. Lord Serwyn, Lord Umbers as his mouth split into a wide grin. Two young women, dressed in armor, who could only be Mormonts, his great-uncle rushing toward him with a relieved expression on his face. Then he was turning to the flagstone tiered steps in front of the great hall, and it felt like everything around him froze. There, standing on the steps of the courtyard, eyes wide, was Hermione. Her face was pale, but her amber-colored eyes were fixed on him, and her curly hair blew in the chilly wind that swept down to them from the north. She opened her mouth, but was too far away to be heard, especially as people around him began to clamor and greet. But Robb knew what she was saying anyway. You're back! Then he was walking toward her, unheeding of the men around him, the looks and stares he was getting as his walk increased in speed until he was jogging and then running the last few steps, and Hermione was coming down the steps. He crushed her against his chest, holding her tight and burrowing his nose in the crook between her neck and shoulder, breathing in her scent deeply. Hermione, he said, his voice low and wretched, the bag Harry gave him dropping somewhere behind in the sword of Gryffindor, making an awful clang as it hit the stone. He felt her fingers claw and dig into his shirt near the back of his neck. She held on tight and squeezed herself tighter to press against him. Her voice was breathless as she asked, How? How did you... He drew back partially, enough to look down into her face as one of his hands slid up to cup the back of her head. His eyes sparkled when he breathlessly laughed. Magic. Her eyes grew wide. Magic? It's a long story, he said, eyes drinking her in, even as he frowned when he noticed the marks under her eyes. It involves magic, and a wizard named Harry. Her round eyes went wider, and she nearly shouted, Harry, you went to Hogwarts? Later, he said, his voice dropping. I promise. I'll tell you everything. She nodded, eyes roaming his face and cataloging differences from her memories. I missed you. Robb closed his eyes and nearly groaned. I missed you more. I promise you that. I doubt it, replied the witch, a bit of a teasing tone entering her voice. When Robb's eyes opened, he looked down at her with all the warmth he could muster. No, I don't think you quite know, Hermione. They were completely enthralled with one another for several long moments. But then someone was speaking, Your Majesty, repeatedly. Robb did not move his head to face them. Instead, he kept his eyes focused solely on Hermione. She started. He shook his head. We have a lot to discuss. Her eyes shuttered briefly. Do we? Fondness crept in his voice, and he dragged a finger affectionately down her cheek as he lowered her from her toes to her feet from their exuberant hug. Yes, I think we do, he replied huskily. Your Majesty, is it life or death? He asked, without looking away. Hermione's lips twitched. Beg your pardon, Your Majesty? Robb repeated himself. Is it life or death? Do you absolutely need me at this moment? Hermione backed away, shaking her head and withdrawing from his arms. There's a lot that you need to be caught up on, Robb. And besides, you should see Sansa and Arya." The young king's blue eyes lit up. "They're here?" Hermione nodded. It was like the bubble that had kept them apart from everyone else burst at that moment because the voices of the men around them began clamoring over one another, each rising in panic and deliverance. "The wildlings are amassing an army. Your Grace killed the Frey bastards that did this. Selling ice in the south. It's very profitable. Worries about whites, Your Highness. Need your signature and seal on at least 10 different letters to be sent out, Your Grace." Robb, inundated by voices, felt quickly swept up by his lords, their voices washing over him as well as their feet carrying him further away from Hermione as they ushered him into Winterfell, the opposite way she was heading. His guard, Lucas, and Patrick quickly fell into step behind him, while Eddard Karstark and Darren Hornwood, Robb nearly did a double take when he saw that the man was missing some of his arm, remained behind with Hermione. As the large group of lords swept him away, Robb twisted, turned, and did his best to keep Hermione's face in his line of vision until he was inside, and her smiling face was the last thing he saw as the doors swung shut behind him and his crowd. Hours later, once the sun had finally risen and his men were seen, listened, and spoken to, Robb finally had a chance to get a few hours' sleep, crashing hard on his bed. His bed, he thought gleefully, before ordering a bath. He was enjoying the heat of his bath, the tendrils of steam rising from the warm water curling his hair more so than normal, especially those at the nape of his neck into tight swirls of auburn. He let his hands drape over the edge of the tub on either side, water dripping from his wet fingertips, as the cool air of the room chilled his arms. It was the first time he felt he could relax. The baths at Hogwarts were nice, especially the prefect's bath that Harry showed him. Although the pervy ghost Myrtle was discomforting, it wasn't home. Home meant that the chilled air was familiar, a comfort, a reminder of his childhood. While not in his childhood room, having been given his grandfather's old room, the view was similar, and the slightly open window, overlooking the Wolf's Wood beyond the stone wall that surrounded the ancestral Stark seat, carried the scent of cool winter air. It was gently snowing outside, the morning sun bright and glinting off large, soft flakes. It was quiet beyond the window, the air still and calm. Robb sighed and sank further. He almost missed the sound of the door behind him opening. At any other time, he would have protested, rising and snatching the sword of Gryffindor, where it rested against a stool, within reaching distance, but only one person would dare breach the sanctity of his room, and more so, his bath. "Aren't you cold?" the feminine voice asked. A cool breeze accompanied her as she stole into the room, using the main door, which she shut firmly behind her. Robb kept his eyes closed, but a small smile stretched across his lips. "Maybe I am. Do you care to warm me up?" The woman snorted. "Does that line work?" Robb frowned. Déjà vu, a term he learned from Luna, stole his breath for a moment, and his eyes opened. The words, the setting, it was so familiar that at once fear turned his blood to ice, and the warm bath was suddenly ice cold. What if this is another dream? He wondered, instantly transported back to when he dreamed of Hermione entering his rooms a long time ago. What if I'm still at Hogwarts? When he didn't reply, remaining shocked still, the feminine voice asked quietly, "Robb?" There was silence, but he heard the fabric of her clothes whisper and rustle as she moved close to him, walking gently across the stone floor and rugs until she was beside him. "Robb, what's wrong?" He felt the air displace as she knelt, and then her cool fingertips ran down from his left shoulder to his hand, catching and spreading droplets of water over the light hair on his forearm. Robb's eyes snapped open and his right hand reached across his body and tightly gripped Hermione's hand. He pulled until they were nose to nose, his blue eyes staring into her amber ones. "Is this a dream?" he asked, his voice low. Hermione slowly shook her head. "I'm here. I'm right here." She reached for his free dangling left hand and gently brought it to her cheek, letting it rest there. "See? You can feel me. I'm real." The king sighed and his eyes slid closed as his tight grip on her hand loosened. Instead, he laced his fingers together. "You keep me grounded," he murmured in the quiet of his grandfather's bedroom. "You remind me what's real and what's not, and I need that." "You thought I wasn't real?" asked Hermione, her voice quiet. She nodded, opening his eyes to look at her. "I dreamed this before." "Oh, did you?" she teased and grinned at him. He rolled his eyes. "Winch." "Hey, now." Smile pulled at his lips, and he leaned forward until their foreheads were touching. Her curly hair was beginning to frizz and dampen from the steam rising from his bath. He didn't even care that she could see all of him. Under the water, all he cared about was that she was here, and he could touch her. He sighed. "I'm glad you're here. So glad." She paused, and then said, even quieter than before, "I'm not going anywhere, Robb." His eyes locked on her amber ones, and then he did what he had wanted to do for over a year now, since his fascination with her grew to such a point that he could no longer deny himself. He closed the minute distance between their lips to taste her. She tasted like sweet wine and the chill of a morning frost, but her lips were warm and moved across his slowly. He took his time, teasing out their kiss, sipping at her like a delicacy before leaning his head and pulling her closer to the edge of the rub to deepen the kiss. He felt her flounder for a moment, and then reached behind him to hold herself up with her free hand, clutching the back lip of his tub. He let his hand slide from her cheek to the back of her hair, and held her in the perfect position to nip at her lips, soothe them, and then dive back in. Hermione, for her part, was matching him. She'd taste and retreat and playfully nip, but she was the bold one who licked at him, eager to deepen their kiss. With a low noise, Robb struggled to rise to his knees in the tub and slipped, water sloshing over the side and soaking the bottom of Hermione's trousers. She laughed, but Robb took one look at her lap, looked up with eyes that had darkened to a midnight blue, and huskily said, "We'd best get you out of those before you catch a chill." Hermione gulped, knowing she should feel chilled from the open window, but her blood was on fire. Something heavy fell over the two of them then, and she slowly rose from where she knelt next to the tub to stand at her full height while Robb matched her move for move. Water sluiced down his body, covered with scars and cuts, trailing through his chest hair and down to hard abs, and Hermione's eyes shot back up, catching Robb's hungry stare. He stepped out of the tub, taking a few steps toward her until they were chest to chest, but he didn't touch her. Instead, he leaned his head down, eyes half-lidded as he surveyed her flushed face, breathing in the same air. "Is this okay?" he asked quietly. Hermione nodded. "Yes." Robb reached up and pushed some of her hair off her shoulder. "I've wanted this for a long time." He paused, and then corrected himself. "I've wanted you for a long time." Hermione's eyelashes fluttered as he leaned closer, his nose brushing against her cheek before ghosting over her lips. "Me too," she admitted breathlessly. She felt his lips curl into a smile, and then he was kissing her again. This time, it was hungry, impatient, and Hermione wrapped her arms up over his shoulders and pulled him down, hard against her, feeling the length of his body press against her and soaking her shirt in the process. He huffed a laugh against her lips, and then they were both fumbling, hands knocking into each other as she struggled to yank her jumper up and over. Then his hands were reaching for her camisole, and hers went to her jeans, button, and then she was towing off her shoes. They stumbled backward, full of breathless laughter, until she hit the bed, pulling him down with her. There was no more talking after that. Later, when the sun was beginning to dip, Robb, propped up on his side, trailed his hand down Hermione's naked back, admiring the sheen and color against the light from the fire in the hearth. The bed sheets rode low, barely covering the swell of her bottom. "You did a good job setting up the Council of Lords," he said quietly. "I think I'll keep it going forward."
"Good," murmured Hermione sleepily, turning her head to face him.
She then pressed back down into the pillow and stifled a yawn. "They're doing a good job, and it's giving them more of a sense of unity." Agreed Robb, eyes following the up and down sweep of his hand. "That tickles," she admonished, but the tiny smile on her lips betrayed her. "What about this? Does this tickle?" he asked, a glint in his eyes as he leaned down and his lips brushed the small of her back. She bit back a moan, unsuccessfully. "And this?" murmured Robb, his lips trailing up until he was mouthing her shoulder and gathering her hair in his other hand, away from her face. "What about this?" His mouth captured hers, and Hermione smiled against his lips, rolling a bit onto her back as he leaned over her. "We haven't had that talk you wanted," reminded Hermione a few minutes later and far more awake. Robb sighed and fell on his back next to her, one arm above his head. "Suppose not, but I'm more concerned about this issue at the wall. Lord Bolton and Lord Karstark both showed me the letter Lady Mormont sent, and Lord Serwyn explained some of the other issues. But really, Hermione, White's a missing commander? That's why we were gonna go," she replied, shrugging her shoulders. Robb's eyes dropped from her face to her chest. "Oh, excuse me, Your Highness. My face is up here." "Sorry," he muttered, but he didn't sound it. Hermione rolled her eyes and slid down the bed, cuddling into Robb's side while his free arm curled under and then around her shoulders. "It's important," she said to him, her voice low. "There's something in the air, can't you feel it? The wall is important. The ward stones protect the Riverlands in the north right now. The south, that war is not done, but it is on hold. There's something brewing to the north." Robb frowned, but he agreed, despite not speaking it aloud. He too had sensed something off when the men were speaking. The strange magic that transported him to Britain and even bringing Hermione to Westeros, the use of her magic which was so different to that of Harry and her other friends, especially with how much she wasn't using her wand, it bothered him. It was almost as magic was returning to Westeros. A very cold gust of air blew through the room, and both he and Hermione shivered. He reached to the foot of the bed and drew the heavy furs up, tucking the corners in around her body as his frown deepened and his eyes tripped toward the open window. The snow was falling harder. In the end, Robb only amended parts of Hermione's original plan. He, along with his guard, Hermione, Brienne, Jaime, and wasn't that a surprise, reading the transcript notes from the man's confession, the eldest Mormont girl, Lyra, and the Lords Bolton, Blackwood, Karstark, and his great-uncle were joining him with a handful of foot soldiers as the first wave to Castle Black. The rest of the army would follow a full day behind, moving slower and to serve as reinforcements if they were needed at the wall, which Robb doubted. Sansa and Arya were rather miffed about being left behind, but Robb was adamant despite lingering unease at the idea of leaving two members of his pack behind. However, the glower on Arya's face made him reconsider, and a part of him acknowledged that it was likely they'd sneak in with the main host, especially given the looks Sansa was sending to not only Eddard Karstark. When did that happen? He wondered, but Sandor Clegane as well. He and Hermione rode side by side at the front of the group of 100 or so, quietly passing back and forth information to catch the other up on what was missed. Robb was sure Hermione was glossing over things, but the pained look in her eyes when she spoke of Torrhen's death and his mother and Daisy's disappearance had him bite his tongue. As they spoke, Robb felt his connection to Grey Wind, who loped in and out of the forest on either side of their trail, hunting for food or playfully jumping into snowbanks, stretch, in ebbs and flows depending on how far his faithful direwolf went from the small host. By the second week, Robb was recounting to Hermione and their guards around him a humorous anecdote of one Ron Weasley finding a squishy, transfigured rat in his pocket, placed there by George. There was elation in his chest when Hermione threw back her head and laughed. Now, of course, Ron didn't know it at the time, grinned Robb, leaning forward in his saddle toward Hermione, but Harry was in on the whole thing. "No," she giggled, a hand covering her mouth. They were almost at Moletown, and he wanted to distract her from the furrow her brows made from her worry about what they would find at Castle Black. "Yes," rejoined Robb. So when Ron turned to Harry, who was sitting there in Grimold, barely keeping his face even, he opened his mouth and went, "Get down!" It was someone at the rear who shouted, and Robb turned his head in time to catch sight of an arrow whiz past, aimed at Hermione. "No!" But she had already moved, swinging her leg over the saddle to face the threat. Her wand was up, and the arrow bounced off a silent Protego, spitting off into the snow. "Wildlings!" Someone else shouted, and then several large figures were bursting from the tree line, war cries screaming from their mouths. With grim determination, Robb drew the sword of Gryffindor from his sheath and wheeled his horse around. Perhaps he was too hasty in dismissing what he heard from his lords and Hermione regarding Castle Black, but the thought was instantly banished from his mind, focused only on the here and now as a skinny, wild-eyed man raced toward him. The sword swung down, cleanly decapitating the wildling and dropping the body, staining the snow around red. Robb turned in the saddle and glanced around, but there were only a few figures remaining, and some, cursing, disappeared into the trees, heading north. "They're gonna Moletown," said an astonished Karstark, his own blade out, but not bloodied. "Should we follow, your grace?" As one of the soldiers finished off the last wilding, Robb realized that there were fewer than 10 who attacked, and most were archers of some kind. Robb stopped and wheeled his horse to face north toward Castle Black. The sun began its descent, and in the distance smoke was staining the horizon black. Dread settled low in his stomach as the realization sank in. Castle Black was under attack from the wildings on the southern side of the wall. Robb's eyes met Hermione's, The amber was brightly lit against the flush the cold air gave her skin, but her face was somber as she regarded the Northern King. Her wand was out, and her hand, clenched tightly against the wood, flexed slightly. The tip pulsed with a held spell that was not yet cast, but she was ready to do battle. Looking over his shoulder, he saw the rest of his men looking at him for their orders. Robb stiffened in the saddle and tilted his chin up. "Ready your blades," he called, his voice carrying through the air. "Prepare for battle." Then he turned his horse again, facing north, and urged it into a gallop. Castle Black was under attack, and he was not going to abandon his half-brother on the wall for anything. A few hours earlier, it was a dry cold that bit into Jon's cheeks, the kind that seeped down into your bones and made everything ache. He thought, after almost 2 years on the wall, that he would be used to it, but he never did. In fact, if he could even measure such a thing, he thought he felt colder than normal. What was she like? Jon turned to face Sam, confusion on his face, as his best friend asked a question from nowhere, as they walked along the top of the wall, checking battlements and skirting around people rushing back and forth with barrels of oil. It took Jon a moment to realize what Sam was asking, and he nearly cursed. "I don't want to talk about this," he thought mullishly. But with Sam peering at him, Jon sighed and said, She had red hair." Sam looked at him blankly for a moment before saying sarcastically, "Oh? How big were her feet?" Frustrated, Jon pursed his lips. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me what it was like to have someone, to be with someone, to love someone, and have them love you back," replied Sam, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. The two stopped walking and looked at one another. "We're all gonna die a lot sooner than I planned. You're the closest I'll ever get to knowing." Jon's brow furrowed. "So you and Gilly never—" Sam blushed, looked away, and shook his head. "No, she just had a baby, and she never offered." "But if she had, you would have broken your vows?" Curiosity tinged Jon's voice, as well as some form of hope. If he was not the only brother to break his vows, if he wasn't alone in his thoughts towards Ygritte, mayhaps he would not feel his shame as strongly. A small quirk of his lips on his round face made Jon instantly wary. He had learned to recognize that mischievous look on the Tarly. The interesting thing is our vows never specifically forbid intimate relations with women. Jon stared. "What?" Sam sent him a wicked grin and repeated their well-known vow. "I shall take no wife." Yes, that's in there. There's no denying that. "I shall father no children." It's very specific. But what our vows have to say about other activities is open to interpretation. Jon's eyes skidded away from Sam's in complete shock as his heart beat faster. The Seven Kingdoms didn't recognize spouse stealing as a form of marriage. Technically, he and Ygritte weren't married in the eyes of Westeros. He hadn't broken his vows. But then he saw Elizar Thorne barking orders further down the wall, clad in his black leather and his thin curls from his receding hairline wavering in the slight chilly breeze, and Jon sighed. "I don't think Sir Elizar cares much for interpretation." Sam shrugged. "Anyway, there's nothing for him to interpret. We didn't." He nudged Jon a bit. "So what's it like?" Jon sighed again, louder and longer, and his thoughts turned inward. There's this person, this whole other person, and you're wrapped in them. They're wrapped up in you, and you for a little while. You're more than just you. He trailed off, his face a furious red, as he caught sight of Sam's rather hopeful and amused eyes. "Well, I don't know. I'm not a bleeding poet." "No, you're really not," agreed Sam easily. "Anyway, what did I get for it? An arrow 6 inches from my heart," groused Jon. The mood quickly shifted and swung from talks of love to talks of war. They started walking again, and Sam's voice was quiet when he said, "There'll be arrows for all of us soon, I imagine." "There will. They've already done the worst thing to me they can ever do." Jon grimaced. "Go get some sleep, Sam. I'll take this watch." Sam nodded, a resigned look on his face. As he turned to walk back the way they had come, toward the elevator shaft, Jon watched him go, his form easily disappearing into the gloom of the evening and the few flickers of the torches that lined the top of the wall. He spent some time conversing with the brothers on the wall, checking provisions until he had all his numbers and facts, and then headed to Thorne. "That's the last of the oil, Sir Elizar," said Jon as he approached. The other man was staring out to the north, eyes firmly fixed on the bushfire that was spreading and growing quickly. 100,000, you say? John nodded. Yes, sir. Thorne's mouth twisted. You can say it if you like. We should have sealed the tunnel while we had the chance, like you suggested. It was a difficult decision either way, sir, replied John diplomatically, trying to keep any judgment from his voice as he spoke. Thorne snorted, the lines on his face deepening. Do you know what leadership means, Lord Snow? The man glanced at John from the corner of his eyes, and John shook his head, silently waiting for the man to continue. He knew when to speak and keep quiet. It means that the person in charge gets second-guessed by every clever little twat with a mouth. But if he starts second-guessing himself, that's the end. For him, for the clever little twats, for everyone, said Thorne, his mouth pressing into a hard line. He squared his shoulders. But this is not the end. Not us. Not if you lot do your duty for however long it takes to beat them back. He turned to look at John straight in the eye. And then you get to go on hating me, and I get to go on wishing your wildling whore had finished the job. Yes, sir, replied John, knowing that was the correct answer. Good, then let's kill some wildlings, said Thorne, turning away, and moving to take position at a better vantage point. Those on the wall fell quiet then, nervous energy pulsing off them as they stood at their posts, bows in hand and a ready arrow in the other to knock, or those standing by the caskets of oil and linen. The air chilled further as the evening wore on, and nothing could be heard at the top of the wall, except the harsh pants of the men, the crackle of the flames in the torches, and the high whistle of the cold wind. Flecks of snow drifted past, catching on clothing and wetting it briefly before freezing. There was nothing but them and the cold expanse in front of them for several long moments. The flames licked at the wood and grew until it was a large bonfire, casting an eerie orange glow on the horizon. The scent of burning sap and wood wafted across the wind toward the wall. Then, somewhere down below, far away, a horn blew. Slowly, black spots of varying sizes began to emerge from the closest tree line to the wall. First, it was only a few spots, and then more and more and more, until there were dozens upon dozens in staggering lines walking steadily toward them, bobbing torchlights with them. Faint shouts drifted to them. John shifted uneasily as he watched the numbers increase. Thorne clenched his jaw. Archers, knock. Everyone else, hold. From down the line, brothers of the Night's Watch knocked their arrows, drawing the strings back as they held their position, picking a target in the far distance. As they did so, Grenadine Tollett's cold hands slipped on the barrel they were rolling, filled with pitch, and they stared, horrified, as it rolled over the edge of the wall and bounced down, disappearing. Thorne grimaced. His hand, which was raised to signal the archers, fell to the side, and John watched him take a deep breath for patience. He then turned to glare at them for a moment, and then he looked around and realized the archers had drawn and were holding their positions with shaking arms. I said, knock and hold. You cunts. Does knock mean draw? Chastised. The men around him replied in chorus, no, sir. Sensing the morale growing, Thorne continued, does fucking hold mean fucking drop? No, sir. You all plan to die here tonight. No, sir. There was satisfaction in Thorne's voice and a small smile on his mouth as he said, that's very good to hear. Draw. As one, the archers drew back their arrows and held position. A horn blast caught them off guard, and Thorne and John turned quickly to their lookout, higher than them in confusion. That brother shook his head and shouted, no, they're down below. What? Gasped John. He turned to Thorne, eyes wide. They're attacking the south gate. Sam's down there. They're coming from both sides of the wall. As he spoke, Janos Slant slid forward, wheeling his arms a bit to keep from sliding on the slippery surface of the wall. They're attacking the south gate, right now. Thorne grit his teeth. Now? Slant nodded in agreement, his voice grating as he repeated the word, now. With everyone staring at Thorne, John could see that he was making those decisions he spoke of to John, his eyes cut to the young Snow. And then he muttered, I'm going down there. He turned to Slant. You have command of the wall. Everyone stared as Thorne quickly strode toward the elevator, leaving the rest to gape at Slint, who was equally befuddled at being given the job. He stared around for a long moment. When no one moved, Thorne turned and shouted, what are you fucking waiting for? Loose! The men who had their arrows drawn released, cutting through the air as fiery streaks. They hit a few targets, but the wildling line stepped back to be out of range. Slight nervously looked around and waved his hand. Well, get on with it. Fire again. John sighed. watching as the men around him fumbled and loosed their arrows at different times, each failing to meet their mark due to the distance the wildlings were keeping. It was just wasted ammunition at this point. Again, and again, the same thing happened. Jon clenched his hands at his side and cut his eyes at Slent, who was pacing nervously behind the line, his face flickering in and out of the light from the torches. Nearby, Gren and Ed looked from Slint to Jon, but Jon could not say anything. Thorne did not put him in charge. He was still just a second aiding Slint. Below, the line began to move forward, including several large lumbering shapes. Slynt's reedy voice broke across the men as some fired at will, and others just watched, unsure of what to do. No discipline, no training. Gang of thieves, that's all this is. A few of the brothers scowled at the man. Most part of the city watching King's Landing. Those men obeyed orders, the man whined. Jon rolled his eyes, sending the man's back a dirty look as he stepped forward. We can't just let him attack the gate. The bars of those gates are 4 inches of cold, raw steel. Those are giants, riding mammoths down there. You think your cold, raw steel is going to stop them? Shouted back Jon. Slate stared at Jon and replied, passively, there's no such thing as giants. Behind, Jon saw Gren mouth what to Ed, and then square his jaw as he stood and wandered down the wall. In confusion, Jon watched him before turning back to Slent, who was staring down at the north end of the wall and the approaching line of the wildling army.
Those are stories for children. The man was still speaking.
Brother Slint. Both Jon and Slint turned to a breathless Gren as he approached. We just got word that Sir Olisar needs you below, continued Gren. Jon's eyes widened and his mouth dropped open. But as Slint turned to him, he snapped his mouth shut. You're the most experienced man we've got. He needs you. It was easy to read Slint's face in that moment. He warred between pride and he needs me and fear, and I don't want to go down there. But for all his talk of discipline, order, and obedience, Slint swallowed and said, needed below? Yes, and made to leave. Gren and Jon watched him, as did the others on the wall, until he was out of sight. Then all eyes turned to Jon. Do you know what leadership means, Lord Snow? Thorne's voice echoed in his mind, and Jon blinked once, twice before swallowing and firming his mouth into a tight line. He turned away from the south and focused on the invaders below. Archers, knock your arrows. He raised his arm, draw, and then dropped his quickly. Below, the flaming arrows hit their targets, and the men seemed to take confidence in the action as Jon began walking along the back. Harnesses, grab your bows. We need to thin them from climbing. Jon repeated the commands as 2 men hung over the extended walkway, their arrows aimed vertically down at the climbers, struggling to hold their breaths against the leather that creaked in the cold and wind. Things seemed to be going well for them until a harpoon-like arrow smashed through the roof of one of their extended walkways, sending wood flying everywhere. Ed ducked and covered his face with his arms as Jon stepped forward and peered down the edge. Shite, he swore, and then shouted, duck. But the warning came too late, as another large arrow sailed past and impaled one of the men on the walkway to Jon's left. All heads swiveled and watched as the man screamed, sailing over the southern end of the wall and down below toward Castle Black. Jon turned back, facing the northern army, and scowled. I hope Thorne has things in hand below. Things can't get worse than they already are. They led the horses in a full gallop toward the southern gate of Castle Black, Robb at the lead with Hermione by his side. Castle Black was not large, but it had a sense of sprawling foreverness to it. There was a wooden gate with 2 watchtowers on either side facing Mole's Town. Inside, the castle was built out of either wood or stone. The stone castle was the largest and tallest of the buildings, etched directly into the wall and off to the right. Around it was several wooden buildings of only 1 or 2 stories, most connected by wooden catwalks or covered walkways, and sometimes attached by a 2-story stone structure that doubled as something else. All roofs were covered with thatched grass, hay, or rushes of some sort, and a few were on fire. Hermione's eyes were forward and fixed on the battlements just slightly above the gate, the 2 wooden towers on either side where the wildlings were climbing in and the few black-clad figures that were screaming as they were pushed out. Robb knew what she was going to do a split second before she did it. He turned and his mouth began, Hermione, no. But she had already let go of the reins and swung one leg over the saddle so she was sitting sideways, but she continued and used the momentum to turn in place and then disappeared with a pop. Swearing, Robb whipped his head around and focused forward, looking all over the towers at the base of the castle for spellfire. But he saw nothing. He swore again, louder, and then shouted, to me. Everyone to me." As they thundered toward the gate, he saw some of the wildlings from the back turn in surprise, and then try to rally a meager defense, some holding up their swords, and 2 archers beginning to knock their arrows. Yet Robb and his wolf pack guards and lords behind smashed into the few wildlings, sending a few of them tumbling as their horses knocked them flying. One crumpled to the ground and was trampled, while another hit a frozen snowbank. Using their continued momentum, Robb directed them at the gate, which smashed open as they burst through, sending wood and a few barrels that were being used to prop the door closed from behind flying. They rode into the courtyard quickly, and Robb wheeled his horse around, drawing the sword of Gryffindor and slashing down at the first screaming figure that ran toward him. The wildling blocked his attack and then hacked forward, aiming not for Robb, but his horse. He didn't see the flash of sword in the darkness, but heard his horse's cry, and it then reared back and he tumbled down from the seat, landing on his knees. He sprung up quickly and blocked the downward swing from the same wildling, who now ignored his bleeding and dying horse. Gritting his teeth, Robb pushed forward with all his strength and shoved his sword toward the wildling, pressing down on him. The man stumbled back, surprise on his face. Then a gray streak rushed at the man, knocking him to the ground. He screamed, dropping his sword and bringing his hands up to push the bloodied muzzle off from him and his neck, but he died with a gurgle as Grey Wind ripped his throat open, spraying blood everywhere. When his direwolf looked up, Robb could swear there was intelligence in him, and so Robb did the only thing he could think of. He said, "Good wolf," in a praising voice, and Grey Wind sat on his haunches and replied with a doggy smile, his tail wagging behind him. The moment was broken as a piercing cry from above, on one of the catwalks around the taller castle towers, caught Robb's attention. "Stop messing around, Stark," he thought with a mental shake. "You're in the middle of battle." So Robb raced forward, his sword in one hand and Grey Wind at the other, leaping and snarling at the nearest wildling that came rushing to meet him in battle below the balcony. Robb raised his arm and slashed down, the blade of Gryffindor easily sliding through the wildling's poor boiled leather armor and bit into the skin and muscle underneath. The man dropped. The courtyard was in chaos. There were wildlings climbing up and around the battlements, savagely and mercilessly beating down at any Night's Watch brothers they could find, hacking with short axes or blunted swords. Their numbers were numerous, even with Robb and his men joining the battle. A loud thud caught Robb's attention, and he turned to see a man laying on a pile of hay, groaning. He had one hand pressed tight to his midsection. Blood glittered in the flickering torchlight. "Who you?" shouted a man with a ferocious scowls as he looked up and caught Robb gapping at him. They were both distracted as a bunch of black brothers came forward and caught the other man under his arms, hauling him up. Robb was about to answer when a screaming woman came at Robb from the side. In response, he viciously slashed with his sword and then thrust into the woman's neck, the sword coming through on the other side. Bloody, "Robb Stark, King in the North," replied Robb, turning back to the 3 men, the one who had fallen and the 2 hauling him up evenly around him. His wolf pack were taking on their own opponents fiercely. He saw Bolton with a grim look on his face, but eyes alight as his sword efficiently worked through his enemies. "You?" The man scowled. "Sir Alistair Thorne." "Ah," thought Robb. Then his attention was diverted by another man, screaming, running toward him. Robb met the first blow, blocking the wildling's attempt, parried, and slid his foot back as he pushed up, disarming the man's sword and sending it flying away. The wildling snarled in fury, and then launched forward for a bare-handed attack, but Robb caught him mid-leap with his sword sticking out of the man. The sword of Gryffindor slid easily back out, and the man sputtered blood from the corner of his mouth before turning an ill-green color and falling dead. Behind, he could hear Thorne shouting, even as he was pulled away, "Hold the fucking gate! Hold it!" Robb cast his blue eyes around the courtyard, trying to find Hermione. He couldn't make out her curly brown hair anywhere in the area. Panic began to bubble in his throat. Where was she? Where had she apparated to? A few paces away, Ed savagely slashed his wildling enemy in 2, bisecting him at the waist, and watched dispassionately as the man's innards spilled before turning away, looking for his next opponent with grim determination. "As the king called." The Karstark looked up. "Your Highness? Where's Hermione?" Ed frowned, paused, and looked around. As he did so, he scanned the general area, and Robb saw his mouth turn down into a scowl. As he realized the witch had disappeared, he turned back to his king. Robb, too, fought the urge to scowl. Hermione was rather willful and tended to go where she pleased. And to be fair, a battle wasn't the place to stop and check in with someone to tell where they were about to go. "Find her," commanded Robb, "and when you find her, stick to her like she's the snitch, would you?" "I what?" Ed's bewildered expression made Robb pause and think about what he just said, wondering what was confusing about his orders. Then, replaying the words back in his mind, he mentally groaned. This is what happens when I spend nearly a year with Quidditch nuts, wizards, and witches. Just frustration made Robb growl. He pointed at Ed and wagged his finger a bit. "Just find her, and don't leave her side." "Your Majesty," nodded Ed, and then he turned into the crowd, slipping between men wearing black, the Night's Watch, and wildlings in all their different colored clothes and leathers. Robb needed a vantage point. He needed to see more of what was happening to make the best decision going forward. He had to trust Ed to find Hermione. Nearby, the base of the elevator shaft reached a platform with 2 sets of stairs leading up. Robb glanced around and then, keeping his back bent low, raced across the churned, muddy ground to the stairs and then took them 2 at a time, throwing himself to the side behind some barrels as an arrow whizzed past his ear. He collided with someone. Both expelled loud oofs, and Robb quickly rolled, rising to his knee and foot with the sword's blade parallel with the ground as he pointed it at the round-faced man in black in front of him. The young man's eyes widened and the crossbow in his hands trembled. "My apologies," muttered Robb, dropping the sword so it pointed down. That's fine," the other man stuttered. A clank caught their attention as a group of 5 brothers exited the elevator shaft and threw themselves to the barrels to their left, avoiding any potential arrows aimed in their direction. The leader was a man with a bushy beard and a square face, one that was filled with determination. The others with him were peering around the barrels at the chaos below. "Gran, we need more men down here," the black brother beside Robb shouted over the noise. "Even with the reinforcements we received." "What reinforcements?" the man, Gren asked, scrunching his face up in confusion. "His," the other brother said, pointing at Robb. He looked the young king up and down, frowning. "Who are you?" I'm getting asked that a lot tonight," he muttered, but then cleared his throat and said, "Robb Stark." "Robb? John's brother!" the round-faced brother exclaimed, voice happy. "The king in the north?" added Gren, eyes wide. "What are you doing here?" Then he frowned. "Wait, I thought you were dead." Robb glanced between the two. "What?" "No, I'm alive. And we received a raven asking for help." "Fucking good timing, I'll say," Gren laughed. "How many are with you?" "Well, myself, my guard, a few of the other lords, and Hermione, of course," rattled off, Robb frowning. "My army is about a day's pace behind." Determination fell on Gren's face. "We can hold until then. We have to hold until then." He then shook his head and looked at the other brother. "John told us to hold the gate. We have to hold the gate." "We need more men here," stressed the other brother. Gren snapped. "Tell John that, then. He's in command." He turned to the 4 others behind him and hefted his axe. "Let's go." Then he and those with him were rushing down the steps and across the courtyard, their swords and axes knocking away any of the enemies as they ignored the fight to get to the far building, which presumably led to the gate. "What gate are they talking about?" asked Robb, turning back to the other man. "The northern gate," the brother replied. "The wildlings have a mammoth and giants. They're probably going to stop them from coming in." Robb pursed his lips. "Very well, I'll gather some of my guards and we'll go with them." The young man's round eyes widened further. "Your Highness, you're going to see John, right?" The other man nodded. "Tell him we're here then, will you?" Robb shifted into a squat and then paused. He turned back to the brother, "And if he sees a witch, let her do her thing." Oh, what?" he heard the brother call, but Robb was then launching himself across the open platform to the far stairs and then pounding down them, slashing at the first unfriendly face he came across. Looking around and noticing a turn to the battle, Robb called loudly above the crashes of swords and the cries of those around him, "Wolf pack, to me!" Grey Wind howled somewhere in the courtyard. There was an echoing howl from those around him. Robb turned, bewildered, to see Patrick Malister had his head thrown back, howling along with Grey Wind, and then Lucas Blackwood and Wendell Manderly copied him. The next moment, finishing their howls, Blackwood and Malister were at his side, breathing heavily with bloodied swords. Lucas had a gash on his forehead, but was ignoring it, and Patrick had a wide grin on his face. "Your Grace?" Malister asked breathlessly. We're going to the northern gates below, instructed Robb, mentally putting away anything he was going to say regarding Mallister's urge to howl with Grey Wind. We need to hold the gate with a few of the Night's Watch brothers. Blackwood nodded. Understood, Your Highness. The three of them began to edge their way around the fringe of the battles in the courtyard. A few times, Robb had a duck from an arrow or flying debris, but slowly, the overall chaos that permeated the battle was beginning to ebb, as Robb's army contingent, small as it was, overtook their opponents with skill and precision. You, shouted Robb, pointing at a Night's Watch brother, leaning against a wall, panting with a hand pressed to his side. The grim-looking man looked up. Which way to the northern gate? Continued Robb. The man jerked his head. Inside, and then down the first left, straight from there. Robb nodded and turned to Mallister and Blackwood. Ready? Yes, Your Grace. Both replied, and the grim man's face melted into shock as the three turned and entered the softly lit interior of the castle. Following the man's instructions, Robb ignored the flickering of fading torches and turned left. Distantly, he heard a roar. Around them, the walls trembled, and bits of dust and plaster fell from the ceiling. What was that? Whispered Blackwood, freezing. I think that was a giant, replied Mallister, with a wild look in his eyes. Robb squared his shoulders and lifted his blade. Prepare yourselves. Robb began down the narrow passage, stepping over bits of rotted wood on the ground and around provisions in barrels. There were several wooden frames jutting out from the walls at intervals to hold the passage, but each trembled as a heavy clang echoed through the space. Ahead, Robb could see a cluster of brothers by an inner gate, and beyond was a figure that was picking up speed and running closer. Wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. The other brothers were joining in, their voices rising with conviction and strength as they spoke their oaths. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come. And with a shout, the giant slammed into the gate, denting it. The giant rammed it again, and the gate splintered, sending sharp shards of steel everywhere. One impaled one of the brothers, too slow to dodge it and keep presence of mind as the giant roared again and reached forward, snatching another brother and pulling. The man screamed. Cooper! Shouted Gren, thrusting his sword at the giant and slashing at whatever he could reach. The giant's ankles, his lower body, his legs. The others around him joined in. Out of the way! Hollered Robb as he raced forward and then dropped, sliding along the cold, icy ground in between two. The brothers who leaped sideways just as he appeared, on his knees, Robb caught and hooked his arm around the giant's lower leg, and with his other hand and his momentum drew Gryffindor's sword along the tendons at the back. He sliced through the leather boot and the muscle just above the ankle bone. The giant roared again, tossing the man he had like a rag doll into the wall, where he left a bloody smear as he slid down and collapsed. The giant then tried to take a step forward but stumbled. Robb was now behind the large creature. Your Grace, shouted Mallister, dodging a fist. Robb grunted in response, but leveled his sword and went for the other ankle, determined to bring the giant down. Already, he could see him slowing, the poison from the blade working its way through the giant's blood. With a slash, Robb cut deeply through the boot, through skin and muscle on the opposite ankle. The giant roared again, this time in pain, more than anger, and turned at the waist to look at Robb. It shouted something in probably the old tongue and made an aborted attempt to step toward Robb. It faltered and stumbled, unable to support its weight. Easy now, murmured Robb, slowly backing up but keeping his eyes on the giant. Easy. The giant fell flat on his front, crying out. A tiny part of Robb twinged in compassion. But as the giant focused its eyes on him, anger and rage burning in them, Robb pushed those emotions aside. Gren, one of the other brothers, and Blackwood darted forward, each picking a part of the giant's back and shoving their swords straight down, piercing through the layers of clothing the giant wore. The giant groaned, trying to uselessly swat at the three on his back. Mallister grabbed one of the arms. The right and the other, standing black brother, joined him. Both wrapped their arms and shoved down with their upper bodies, slamming to the cold floor as they kept the arm from flailing. Keep him still, shouted Gren. I'm trying, one of the brothers shouted back. Robb took the opportunity and stepped forward, next to the giant's head, extremely weakened and dying from the basilisk poison on the blade. Robb stared down at the man. His face was long, northern in feature, but he had a blunted, flattened nose and narrow, small eyes. Tears gathered at the corner of those eyes now. From frustration, anger, or realization, Robb wasn't sure. Instead, he quietly and slowly raised his sword with both hands above his head and swiftly brought it down on the giant's neck, severing the head from its body in one smooth stroke. Blood spurted, and Robb turned his head away to keep it from getting on him or in his mouth. The silence following the giant's death was deafening. Is it over?" whispered one of the brothers. Gren sent the man a withering glare. "Its head is separate from its body. I'd imagine it's fucking dead." There was a general sigh of relief from those who remained. "Your Grace," began Mollister, "should we return to the courtyard? To the battle?" Robb nodded. "I need to find Hermione. She disappeared before we entered." There was a slight twitch to Mollister's eyes and a vague look of alarm as he realized Hermione had given them the slip. The young man jerkily nodded his head in agreement. "Who's Hermione?" asked one of the brothers, looking around. Gren shrugged. "Don't know, don't care. If they're fighting for us, that's all that I need to know." "She is," confirmed Robb. "Then what are we waiting for?" asked Gren, turning to the others. He spared a glance at the fallen form of Cooper, pain spasming across his face briefly before he looked away. "Let's go kill some wildlings." Hermione apparated in the left tower above the southern gate. Her pop was masked by the sounds of grunts, screams, cries, and the clanging of swords and axes as she appeared. But immediately, someone saw her arrival and turned to her, mouth open and eyes wide, their axe above their head, ready to swing down. Hermione pursed her lips and pointed her wand at the man dressed in shabby, mismatched clothing layered on top of one another, and thought expulso. The bright blue light burst from her wand, illuminating the interior of the dark tower for a moment, turning everything sapphire. Then the spell connected with the man, and he was blasted backward, through the opening on the other side of the tower's catwalk, landing with a solid thump on the hard earth below, a gaping wound in his chest, where the spell hit. Hermione stared down at her wand, at the smoke wafting from the tip, and then at where the wildling stood before. Everyone in the hallway stood frozen, unsure of what just had happened. Her breath caught in her throat, and Hermione thickly swallowed as her stomach churned. Her hands tingled, and her wand thrummed in anticipation. The killing of the wildling felt right. Slowly, Hermione turned her eyes to the next person. They gulped and took a hesitant step back before firming their resolve. Two other wildlings, a woman and man, behind the first, took up point on either side of the first man, the woman raising her axe and the man fingering the bladed edge of his sword, already wet with blood. There were several others lingering closer to the far end of the tower, keeping further back, waiting their turn. Hermione cast her eyes at the three of them and then around at the covered walkway. "I have an idea," she thought with an upturned twitch to her lips, and cast a containment charm on the catwalk, locking them all in the space. There were a few other wildlings further down, and one attempted to leave the tower, but found themselves bouncing back from the containment charm in the doorway. "What magic is this?" That man scowled. "It's my magic," replied Hermione, causing them to all look at her in confusion. "Enjoy." "What?" Hermione slashed her wand down, letting her magic bubble from her hand into the tip and crackle as white-hot lightning tinged with blue burst from the tip, skating across the floor and walls of the catwalk and towers, spreading further and further. As it touched each wildling, they screamed and writhed as the current passed through their bodies, making them arch and twist in grotesque ways. The smell of charred flesh soon overpowered the tower, and Hermione turned on her heel, apparating out and tearing down her containment charm in one go. She appeared in the courtyard and saw Robb and Grey Wind side by side. The dire wolf was bloody from his muzzle and down his front, including his paws, and Robb was wild-eyed with his auburn hair disheveled as he looked around. From her side, a shrieking woman with a pick of some kind raced toward her, but she cast a mild look at the woman and raised her wand. A bright light ripped from it, jagged and bright, and slammed into the woman's hand, holding the pick. She screamed as her wrist disintegrated, slowly, the skin turning gray and ashy until she clutched at the stump of her head. When she looked up, Hermione cast a severing charm across her throat, and the woman fell back to the ground, eyes open in shock. The witch turned her back to the body dispassionately, ignoring the dark blood spreading around the woman's neck. The battle in the courtyard was beginning to thin. Bolton was happily and slowly cutting his wildling target along the man's wrist and ankles. The reputation of the flayed man's sigil was well given. Karstark was wiping the blood from his face, and Blackwood was making quick work of a wildling with sunken eyes. The Blackfish, Jaime Lannister, Brienne, and Lyra were not in the courtyard below. An arrow whizzed by Hermione's face, and she jerked back, casting Protego instinctively, and watched it ping off the shield. She looked up at where it came from, and met the wide eyes of a woman, who hastily dropped her next arrow, and turned, fleeing from her perch. An open window from the castle's second floor, across the courtyard. Her long, vibrant red hair streaked behind her as she did so. A Weasley? Utterly confused, Hermione narrowed her eyes and disapparated. Landing on the window ledge, she wobbled precariously, but slid down into the room, looking around. Where did she go? It was dusty, dank, and cold like everything else so far had been. The walls were wooden, and parts were rotted. There were a narrow desk and a cot. Neither used if the amount of dust and debris on them were any indication of use. Hermione took a tentative step forward, and the floorboard creaked. She winced. Now, where are you? She wondered, edging forward slowly. Casting a spell on her feet to silence them wouldn't help. Not when the floorboards themselves were buckled and rotted, but Hermione took her time to gingerly step and avoid areas she felt were the most cracked. She inched her head around the doorway and saw the interior hallway. Devoid of life, the sounds from outside were muted, dimmed like they were coming from underwater, and all Hermione could hear was her harsh breathing and the whoosh of blood as it coursed through her. Her magic tingled, racing up and down her limbs to the point of pain, where her fingertips were going numb at withholding it in. It was strange. She had never felt that way before. The feeling of power pumping through her, nor the need to expel it quickly and violently. Perhaps there is more magic here than I thought, she frowned, looking around the barren castle interior. As she inched down the hall, wand held aloft, and in a loose grip, ready to flick or slash. Echoing thumping footsteps from above had Hermione pause in her path. She tilted her head up and strained her ears, her eyes following the sound as they moved down the hallway to the closed door ahead of her. Hermione tapped herself on the head with her wand, disillusioning herself and blending into the dark wood walls, just as the door opened and a yellow-toothed, skinny man stepped in. It was a wilding dressed in his layered furs. He was clutching a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other. Both were bloody. With her eyes narrowed, Hermione stepped forward. You're in my way. I need to find her. A floorboard creaked, and the man spun around, eyes flashing and sword held up. But his eyes darted left and right as Hermione paused, perfectly blending in with the dark surroundings. The man snarled and stepped forward until they were mere feet apart. The nasty side of Hermione urged her forward, and she stopped a mere hand away from the man. He was breathing heavily, his breath putrid, and his pupils were shot wide and wild as they looked around the hallway. He stunk of sweat, blood, gore, and other scents that Hermione did not want to think about. With her wand held between their two bodies, midsection, Hermione allowed for the disillusion to drop. The wildling's eyes widened, and he raised his dagger to pierce down. But Hermione cast a spell first. The same purple flash of Dolokhof's curse burst from her wand, hitting the man in a jagged, licking spellfire, and the man collapsed soundlessly, his mouth gapping open and closed as he struggled to breathe, as his organs were slowly crushed. Hermione glanced down at him as she stepped over his prone body and went through the open door. She was beyond the first courtyard where the gates were, in another long one that seemed to include the smithy. As there was a building with a tall smokestack, she leaned against the railing and peered down into the fighting, spotting Lyra with her dual blades fighting alongside Brienne with her sword. Opposite of Hermione, along another building by a set of stairs, a wilding man was staring open-mouthed at Brienne until an arrow lodged into his shoulder. He shouted something and went to turn, but a black brother coming down the stairs in front of him attracted his attention, and he kicked at the man, sending back sprawling back onto the steps. The brother blocked the large wildling's downward swing of his sword, and Hermione turned her attention elsewhere, looking for that flash of red. There! The wilding woman was shooting arrows down on the courtyard from a broken railing, crouched as she pulled from her quiver behind her back. Every arrow she rained down from above hit their targets, dropping the Night's Watch brother. They did not get up. Hermione turned on her heel and disapparated over. Her arrival was behind the redhead and masked by the sound of battle. The wildling's hand was reaching behind for another arrow, so Hermione swished her wand and vanished them. When her hand caught nothing, she turned around and gasped. "Hello," said Hermione, giving her a little wave, cataloging the hair color, the dusting of freckles along the woman's face, and her brown eyes. "Shit," the redhead said, turning and tumbling headfirst over the edge of the wooden catwalk. Hermione's mouth dropped open, and she paused. Looking around, she wondered, am I really that scary? But then blinked and disapparated down to the courtyard, watching as the redhead landed on a sloped roof that she rolled from, only to land on her feet at Hermione's. She tossed her head back, her hair pulled off her forehead in a tight braid with the rest swishing around her shoulders in riotous curls like Hermione's own, only to widen her eyes at Hermione. She glanced quickly behind her at where she had previously been, to where Hermione was now, her mouth open. "How?" "I took the stairs," deadpanned Hermione. "Cardio is important." The redhead looked confused. "Are you missing something?" continued Hermione, gesturing to the woman's quiver. "It was you!" The young woman accused her, rising from her crouch. Her hand tightened around her bow in anger. "How did—" She let out a tiny screech of anger, eyes darting around. A few steps away, near a body against a piled snowbank, was a half-full quiver. Both women eyed it, standing still, until the redhead turned on her heel and raced for them. Just as her fingers went to grasp the arrows, they flew out of reach, zooming past her head and over her shoulder. She turned to watch them, and her mouth dropped open as the arrows, all vertical and clustered, were caught in Hermione's free left hand. "Keeping you from your preferred weapon is kind of a big deal right now," said Hermione, twisting her mouth into a wry expression. "Sorry. I don't need those," the wildling woman replied, reaching her waist and pulling out a short dagger from its sheath. "You don't need that, either," replied Hermione, and with a wave of her wand, the blade vanished too. The woman stared down at her empty hand for a moment. When she looked back up at Hermione, she let out a loud shriek of anger, and then launched herself forward. The attack was unexpected, and Hermione was not expecting it, when the young woman plowed into her, and the two went sprawling onto the hard earth. Hermione hit the ground first, feeling a jagged piece of hardened mud poke into her back. She groaned. The redhead began scrambling for the quiver still in Hermione's left hand, her cold fingers prying at Hermione's to open her fist. Hermione rolled, throwing her weight at the other woman, but with all her layered furs, she was rather heavy, but it did force her to stop clawing at Hermione's hand. Her hair swung forward and into Hermione's face and mouth, causing her to sputter as the redhead reared back a fit. The punch landed on Hermione's cheek, swinging her head around. She blinked in shock for a moment, staring wildly ahead at a curly-haired young man in all black as he swung his sword, only for the tall, bald wildling he was fighting to knock it away with a loud yag as he swung his giant axe down. The Night's Watch brother nimbly jumped back, but there was a look of panic on his face with each skip he made, with each swing of the axe coming closer and closer. He grabbed something from a nearby weapons rack and landed a smack on the larger man's cheek, and Hermione used her weight and momentum to swing back around, her wand up in the woman's face as she cast Reducto. The redhead had good reaction time, though, and jerked her head away. She was forced to roll off Hermione, though, and the two scrambled up to their feet, Hermione with her back to the Night's Watch brother. Hermione watched wearily as the redhead's eyes trailed from her to the man behind fighting the wildling. Her mouth flattened, and Hermione immediately shifted her position so it blocked sight of the fighting man. The redhead's eyes traveled back to her. "You're fighting me first," Hermione said quietly. "You have a weapon and I don't," she replied, glancing down at Hermione's wand. Hermione's mouth turned down. "Then pick up those arrows." Her eyebrows rose. "But I warn you, it still won't be an even fight." The woman scoffed. "For you?" Hermione shook her head. "For you?" The two eyed each other warily a bit longer. But the young woman seemed to take Hermione's word and slowly crouched down, never removing her eyes from Hermione's as her hand extended, and she groped a bit until she caught 4 arrows from the collection. Hermione summoned, she quickly drew them toward her, and stuck 3 in her quiver, and 1 knocked in her bow. Then, in a smooth movement that was a blur, she raised her bow and drew back, letting go and sending the arrow flying toward Hermione. The arrow bounced off a silent Protego shield, pinging off somewhere to the side. Hermione took a step forward. The redhead gaped for a moment, then snapped her mouth shut and heavily frowned, her eyebrows drawing down into a fierce V. She knocked another arrow and let it fly. Again, Hermione blocked with her spell, stepping forward again. Another arrow was drawn, leaving one left in her quiver. Hermione shook her head as she stepped forward again, causing the wildling to skitter back. The arrow pointed at Hermione, but not released. I could do this all day, you know? The woman's mouth flattened, and she released the arrow. This time Hermione allowed it closer, removing her shield spell, and instead knocked the arrow aside with a wind charm, sending it flying back toward the wildling instead. She ducked. One left, called Hermione, walking forward and crowding the woman until they were halfway across the courtyard, near a bloodied anvil. The wildling withdrew the last arrow, carefully and slowly knocked it, and drew the string back until she was ready to release. She aimed it at Hermione, eyes dark and intense. The two stood still for a long moment, and then the wildling's eyes trailed over Hermione's shoulder and to the side, holding on a figure. Curious, Hermione turned, wand tight in her grip, and saw the same curly-haired young man from earlier, only this time covered in blood from several gashes on his forehead and cheek, as well as a split lip. He too was staring at the redhead as he breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling quickly. Did she just decide not to fight me anymore and go for this guy? Wondered Hermione, glancing between the two. But then she looked closer and saw the gutted look on the man's face, partially resigned at his fate, but also accepting. He smiled at the redhead, nodding his head a bit. Turning back to the woman, Hermione watched as she swallowed thickly and grit her teeth, like she was trying to convince herself to shoot the man. Her bow trembled and she smiled, although it was a quick and fleeting thing. No. Later, Hermione would wonder why she cared, what caused her to react, given she had been fighting the young wildling woman as well as hunting her across the courtyard, but something in her instinctively caused her to react, to move. Her wand swept up from her waist, curving into a perfect arch as the snow around her, from the ground, from the snowbanks pushed to the side, from the air, swirled together and consolidated into a thick sheet of frozen snow in front of the wildling. An arrow was caught in the frozen block, its tip on the other end, and a scant inch from the wildling's chest. She was staring down at it with wide eyes, and she took a stumbled step back, away from what would have been her death. Ygritte. The man rushed past Hermione, and she turned to trace where the arrow came from. A young boy stood on the stairs, a bow hanging by his side with a shocked look on his face as he looked at Hermione. She frowned, and he turned, scrambling and tripping up the steps. She disappeared and appeared on a few steps above him, staring down. He paused in his scramble and looked up at her, fear on his face. That wasn't very nice, she said mildly, noting his black colors. He's a Night's Watch brother. I can't harm him, but I can take him out of this fight. Stupefy. The boy crumpled on the steps. Hermione flicked her wand and levitated him off to the side, behind some crates and cast a notice me not on him. The fighting was still occurring in the courtyard, but Stark had pushed through from the inner courtyard. There was a slow but steady push from Robb's forces against the wildlings, but it was still taking time. It's taking too long, thought Hermione with a frown. I need to end this. She looked up, eyes narrowed, at the long elevator shaft that protruded from the slick white wall, its top disappearing into the swirling snow and night sky. Hermione glanced at who called her name, spotting Ed. He still had his sword, but was leaning heavily on one leg. Don't move, the Stark cautioned, beginning to limp his way toward her and dodging around small pockets of battles. His Grace is looking for you. Sorry, Ed, called Hermione in reply, making the man freeze. But there's something I need to do. Hermione! What? But she looked up again and then turned on her heel. When she reappeared, she was at the bottom of the elevator shaft, its doors hanging open and creaking slightly in the breeze. There was no one to begin the mechanism to take her up, so she would have to go up it herself. The spell cast on the gear had it turning, and she stepped into the shaft just as it lifted from the platform. She stepped back until she stood in the middle, arms crossed and staring forward as she rose higher and higher. Soon, the men fighting below were nothing but black smudges disappearing into the gloom and blurring with the few fires lit around Castle Black. The cold was biting the further up Hermione went. She shivered and eyed the covered ceiling of the shaft, wondering what the top of the wall was like. Snow swirled around her, some slipping down the neck of her overcoat. The elevator reached its summit, and Hermione stepped out, looking around. The top of the wall was wide, a good couple of meters, with some covered stations and platforms dotting its edge to the north and away from the castle. A few men were rushing back and forth along the path, but most were peering over the edge of the wall, firing arrows. Something was humming below her, vibrating through her boots. A strange, low hum that she only ever felt at Hogwarts or in Diagon Alley. Magic calling to magic. Hermione looked down, contemplatively, as she lifted a boot and carefully stepped forward. Once her entire foot was planted on the wall, the hum increased in vibration, and Hermione stifled a gasp as her magic flared through her body like a hot flash. As Hermione lifted her other foot, the hum lowered until it nearly disappeared, and her magic surged from her, leaving her cold. Then she stepped forward, repeating with her other foot, and the hum increased and her magic rushed through her again. Didn't Arya once mention that the wall was built using magic from a Stark ancestor? Thought Hermione, repeating the careful stepping motion a few times as she walked forward. The reaction was odd, and each step was like a swell of her magic, growing and building in her until she was woozy, listing to the side. There was an empty platform near her, discarded weapons and bows, as well as a bleeding body with several arrows peppering the man's chest. Unable to move further, Hermione sank to her knees, and her bare hands dug into the light dusting of snow covering the top of the wall, gathering it into a tiny pile under her palm. She began breathing heavier, bowing her head, and squeezing her eyes shut tight. Hermione curled her hands into fists as she began to struggle to breathe. The magic began to press on her, heavy on her chest, despite her bowed form. The magic coursing through her began to resonate in time to her heartbeat, sending blinding pain through her head with each pass. Cold seeped from the wall into her hands and then began to spread, slinking up her forearms and from her boots to her legs. It was like freezing ice water rushing through her veins, moving quickly and spreading from one part of her to the next until it reached her chest, wrapping around her heart and lungs and squeezing. Hermione gasped, tears coming to her eyes and freezing before they fell, coating her eyelashes with tiny droplet icicles. The cold spread further, up the back of her neck and along her hairline, up past her ears and around to her temple, pounding with the furious feel of her magic as it pushed through her body and up with only one way out. Hermione threw her head back and screamed. She was looking up, "Your Grace," to the wall. Ed's words echoed in Robb's mind as he scrambled across the slick wooden platform. The elevator shaft was still at the top, meaning Hermione had made it, but no one had come down yet. Come on, he muttered, turning to the crank mechanism at the side and pushing, hoping to turn it around so the shaft returned to the base of the tower. He threw all his weight against it, straining with his body. Robb grit his teeth and closed them tight, hoarsely crying out as the mechanism stuck, frozen. Then it gave a little, and he nearly tripped. Robb opened in his eyes and saw Ed on one side of him, a grim look of determination on his face. Mallister and Blackwood were next to him, and on Robb's other side, he saw the same bushy-bearded brother he helped earlier, Gren. The other survivors from the Northern Gate were then there as well, and Gren was shouting, "Let's do this, men. Together now. Push." The men all heaved together, and Robb felt his heart lift. He turned back to the crank, grabbing hold of the spoke, and pushed against it with Ed. The chains creaked, and it moved, sliding backward. Again. They pushed a second time, and the mechanism moved a bit easier, and then a third easier again, and a fourth until the chains clanked and began moving on their own. Robb whooped loudly and looked up, peering into the snow. "How long does it take?" "A few minutes," replied Gren, also looking up from his side. "What's so important up there? The fighting's all but done now." But Robb just shook his head, anxious as he kept his eyes on the elevator platform that slowly appeared from the snow, slipping down carefully. He didn't wait until it reached the bottom. Instead, Robb threw himself forward and crawled onto the platform as soon as he could. Hauling himself up, the sheathed sword of Gryffindor clattered loudly against the floor. "Send me up, Ed," commanded Robb as he crouched. Ed frowned. "Your Grace, you shouldn't go alone." "It's fine," snapped Robb, rising to his height. He glared down at the men watching him warily. "Hermione's up there, Ed, and I'm going after her, so send me up." With a sigh, Ed turned to Mallister and Blackwood. "You heard his Grace." The three disgruntled guards, along with a confused Gren, went back to the mechanism and began pushing it in the opposite direction. With its frequent use, the chains moved smoothly, and soon Robb was being lifted, the elevator rising at a slow but steady pace. When he was nearly at the top, and he could only see a few specks of fire from the courtyards of Castle Black below, the wall shuddered and the shaft trembled, sending Robb to his knees. "Oh, that can't be good," he thought, looking up as terror stole through him. "Hermione!" Once the elevator came to a stop, Robb scrambled out, looking forward and back as the men around him shouted and grabbed onto whatever posts they could to keep their balance. One man wasn't so lucky and went screaming over the edge. A blazing light blinded Robb for a moment, accompanied by a fierce cold wind that slammed into him like the force of being hit in the chest with a hammer. He fell backward, blinking back against spots as the light faded. But the light itself was only condensed into pulses, no longer spreading and overpowering like looking into a sun. Robb lifted his head, groaning as he rolled onto his side, looking for the source of the light. Instead, the pulses were coming from a prone figure on its knees, several yards ahead. Robb's heart stopped beating. "Hermione?" he shouted. The wall continued to tremble, gaining more violence as it did so, and Robb struggled with his steps. Each was a trial, and often he was knocked to the side, catching himself on a crate or a barrel or another Night's Watch brother on one occasion. "Where do you think you're going?" the man shouted at him, right in his face. "I'm going to her," shouted back Robb over the howling wind. "Who?" The man glanced back and then at Robb, shaking his head. "It's too dangerous. That's a demon. Try to stop me." The man shouted something at Robb, but he didn't hear and pushed past, squinting his eyes against the wind. The wall beneath his feet was actively shuddering, pieces of ice chipping off from sections and falling to the ground below. Robb eyed the nearest edge warily until he was only a few feet from Hermione. She was still kneeling, but looking ahead at the land north of the wall. Only her eyes weren't the honey-colored Robb knew so well, but whited out. Ice spread from her knees, filling any cracks made just as it made new ones. It was a constant cyclical event of break, fill, and Hermione was entirely unaware of it. "Hermione," shouted Robb, falling to one knee, bowing his head against the wind. He grit his teeth and rose against the force buffeting against him, pushing despite the current pushing him back. "Hermione, please." A giant shudder rippled out from Hermione, sending Robb onto his back. He turned and watched the ripple race down the edge of the wall, pulling himself to the edge to watch. As it moved it down, gaining speed as it did so, any wildlings climbing were knocked off, sent flying to their deaths. As the wave reached the foot of the old structure, it crashed into the ground with a dull thud. With wide eyes, Robb watched as the wave moved out, flattening the mammoths on the ground and the few wildlings who were still advancing, rippling across the snow and kicking it up until it hit the tree line. The first few rows of trees were demolished, turned into splitters until the wave eventually smoothed out. Gulping, Robb turned back to Hermione, only to gasp as she turned to look at him. Her hair was blowing everywhere in the breeze, up and around her head with a life of its own. Her eyes were fully white, with no pupil, and there was a strange blue-tinted glow to them. The snow around her was glittering, turning into bits of ice that clung to her exposed skin and making her glisten ethereally. "Hermione," whispered Robb, fear reaching up and stealing his voice. "They need to pay," she said, but her voice was strangely layered, like she was speaking with not just her own voice, but others as well. "Who?" cried Robb, inching away from the wall and closer to her. The wind shifted from howling and piercing at him to around, creating a strange dead zone around the two. Despite that, Hermione's hair still blew around her kneeling form. "The wildlings, they attacked. They hurt people," she frowned. "They killed people. They will pay. This must end." "Hermione, no," said Robb, creeping forward, eyes firmly on her face, despite the fear he felt for her. He had never seen her act this way, or use her magic so freely. He glanced down at her hand and saw that her wand wasn't even in her grasp. In fact, he couldn't see it anywhere. "Why not?" she asked, frozen lines down her cheeks. "Why should they not pay for what they did? The blood they spilled?" "Do you strike down a child that doesn't know any better?" asked Robb. "They're wildlings. This is what they do. It is wrong. They must pay." Robb's heart clenched. "Hermione, you don't like hurting people. You don't want to hurt people." Hermione tilted her head to the side in a strange manner, and Robb's fear increased. Is this still Hermione? Or is something speaking through her? "I do not." Robb shook his head. He was only a few feet from her now, and he slowly knelt to be on eye level. "No, you don't. Harry and Ron told me so many stories about you, and Ginny and Neville too, and Luna. They spoke to me of a witch who fought for injustice and against terror, a witch who didn't create terror." There was a bewildered look on her face. "Create terror? Who's scared?" Robb cast a hand behind him. "All the men of the Night's Watch, Hermione, and it's not just what you're doing now. Ice has fallen off the wall. What if it landed and hit someone? What if it hit Ed? Ed? Hermione's voice was slightly pained, and something pulled back from the icy blue of her eyes. But just as swiftly, it returned. You do not get to lecture me, Robb Stark. You were not here to see what I did. The accusation was like a punch to his gut. Robb swiftly drew in a pained breath. I know, and I'm sorry, but what? There was a sharp look to her face, her cheekbone slashes against the hollows of her cheeks. And for a moment, Robb was startled to see how different Hermione looked. And that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't quite as human as he thought. You were not here. You left me alone, the witch continued to cry. But something was bleeding through the layered voices, stripping them away and leaving only raw emotion and a single voice. I know, Hermione, I know, said Robb quietly, shuffling forward. He reached forward, cupping her cheek. I didn't mean to go. You know I didn't. I don't know who I am anymore, the witch cried, blinking as tears spilled down her cheeks, freezing immediately and leaving crystallized lines. I don't think I can control it. My magic feels so different. Robb, it's like it wants to be let out and only violence satiates it. But that's not me. It's not. Shiz, the king said, wrapping another arm around her and drawing her close. Hermione's freezing hands reached up and gripped at his back. She hiccuped against him, sobbing. It's like there's a part of me I don't recognize anymore. Ever since I came here, I feel like I'm losing myself. Like a part of me is drifting away. A single snowflake caught in a blizzard, and I can't find my feet anymore. Robb clutched at her tighter, blinking back his own tears as he felt her shudder and gasp. Oh God, Robb, I've killed, no, murdered. Hermione, please. She shook her head against his, shaking. No. This place is changing me, Robb, and I don't know if I should No. Robb drew back from their hug, framing her face tightly, large hands bracketing her cheeks, and peered intently into her amber eyes, no longer glowing brightly, his forehead pressed against hers, and she sighed quietly. No, don't say it. Don't even think it. We're here, we're in this together. You hear me, Hermione? Together. She stared up at him. Together, Hermione, he implored, fighting the urge to shake her. Instead, he leaned even closer, so all that they could see was each other. So, whatever you're going through, whatever is happening to your magic, it doesn't matter, okay? Because we're going to figure it out together, you and me. Hermione collapsed against Robb. He clutched Hermione's shaking form against him tightly, ignoring the damp and cold seeping into his clothes as he heard her sigh quietly into his stiff, partially frozen hair. The wind stopped howling, the snow stopped swirling, turning into a light, gentle flutter, and silence descended on the top of the wall. Even the shouts and distant cries from the battle below were quiet. The battle for Castle Black was over. To the east, the first, tiniest rays of morning sun pierced through the heavy cloud cover, and together, in silence, they surveyed the north of Westeros, all which lay at their feet. Several members of the Night's Watch were dead, their numbers even further depleted, and Robb had directed and helped Jon as he and his guard rounded up the dead and began to construct a large fire pit in the courtyard. Lord Bolton and Lord Blackwood had come out of the battle with several wounds, but neither were serious. His uncle had spent most of his time with a discomforted Jaime Lannister, moving through the buildings, looking for wildlings. They had the easiest time of the battle, while Lyra and Brienne both spotted several heavy gashes. Brienne was even resting near a pale-haired wildling who kept making eyes at her. Hermione, however. Robb watched her warily as she kept her eyes downcast as she moved slowly through the hall, which had been turned into a makeshift infirmary. It was filled, and Robb watched as she spoke in soft voices to members of the Night's Watch and wildlings alike, offering to heal them with what she could do. She would move on to the next person, leaving the one who came before staring after her in awe or disquiet. Her pale face and the smudges under her eyes worried him, and he found himself at her side before he realized he moved. You don't have to do this, he muttered, catching her arm. She glanced up at him, pain in her eyes. Yes, I do. I hurt people, Robb, with my magic. It's only right I also use it to heal. Robb frowned but let go, watching as she moved to the side and away from him. He watched her form a bit longer until his eyes moved to the side of the room. Ed was badly wounded with a deep cut to his leg, so he could not watch the witch Robb loved. Instead, Robb caught Patrick Mollister's eyes, and he jerked his head in Hermione's direction. The floppy-haired young man, lounging against the far wall in a dark corner, nodded and rolled off, moving to stand near Hermione as she crouched near a young boy who was fearfully looking at her. Robb turned away, clenching his hands at his sides. If I can't ease the guilt for her, then I can at least ensure she does it on her own with someone watching her. Robb left the infirmary, stepping outside, and surveyed the survivors dragging and carrying bodies. His stomach turned, not from disgust, but from something more akin to fear, and he instinctively reached for the hilt of the sword of Gryffindor. Robb! Robb jerked his head up. Jon stood in front of him for the first time in 2 years. He was paler than he was back in Winterfell, but his curly black hair was the same, as well as his dark gray eyes. He had grown taller and leaner in the meantime as they matured into men, and carried himself differently from the skulking he used to do. "Brother," greeted Robb, a smile stretching across his face. They reached forward and embraced each other at the same time, laughing. He drew back. "Look at you." "Me?" replied an astonished Jon. "How about you, Your Highness?" Robb grimaced. "Don't call me that. Just not you. Not family." Jon dipped his chin in acknowledgement. The two stood side by side for a long moment, and then Jon muttered, "We held them off, with your help." "That is a great victory," replied Robb with a small smile. Jon sighed. "Not so much. Mance was testing our defenses, and he almost made it through. And he has more giants. He has more mammoths. He has 1,000 times as many. They'll hit us again tonight. Maybe we can hold them off for a day or two, but we'll never beat them. My army will be here by tonight or tomorrow," replied Robb evenly. "He'll hold until then." Jon shook his head. "No, I need to go." Go where?" Robb asked incredulously. "We've only just reunited, Jon. You can't go. I'm here as part of an investigation, one that seems very warranted now. I'm going to find Mance." Robb stared. "I beg your pardon, but I believe I just heard that you are planning on going to go beyond the wall to find a man who is leading your enemy." He then stopped and shrewdly looked at his brother. "Have you been ordered to go parley?" "Who's left to give orders?" scoffed Jon. "The Wildling army is only an army because of Mance. He united 100 warring tribes. Without Mance, they lose their leader, they lose their purpose, they go back to fighting each other, scatter back to their homes." Robb's eyes narrowed. "Without Mance, you say? Are you going to kill him?" Jon turned and met his brother's blue eyes. "I'll try." "I'll forbid you. I'm a king. I can forbid it." Jon shook his head. "I'm a member of the Night's Watch. We have no kings, Robb. You can't command me." "Just watch me try," Robb snapped. "The Wildlings will never let you within 100 yards of him, and even if they did, even if you manage to kill him, they'll kill me. But if I don't go, they'll kill me anyway." Jon looked at Robb askance. "They'll kill the rest of us too, including that woman you came with." "Don't," warned Robb, his voice a low growl. "You know, I'm supposed to be the hot-headed one, Jon, not you. It's a bad plan." "Do you have a better one?" Robb pursed his lips, and a wry smile came to Jon's. "I didn't think so," he said. He shook his head. "It's okay. I think I'm on borrowed time anyway." He was interrupted by loud shouts. Both he and Robb shared a confused look, and then strode forward, out from underneath the overhang and toward the noise. The round-faced brother Robb had shared a barrel, hiding behind, was rushing to them, a letter tight in his fist, as he waved it. "Sam," asked Jon, as the man approached. "What is it?" "A raven," he wheezed. Just arrived." "What's it say?" asked Jon, reaching for it, but Sam bent at the waist, his hands including the one with the letter at his knees, as he caught his breath. Jon waited impatiently, eyeing his friend, but Robb stifled a laugh, which made Jon send him a glare. Finally, Sam wheezed once more and breathed out, "From Eastwatch by the Sea. They're sending help, further reinforcements against the Wildling army. Mance Raider has." "Where did they get the men?" asked Jon, rearing back in shock. "It's the thing," he gasped, still struggling to find his breath. "The help that's coming? Pike's written that. It's Stannis Baratheon." And Sam stopped and shot Robb an apologetic look. "He's claiming he's king of the Seven Kingdoms." Robb and Jon shared a mutually confused look before turning back to Sam. "Well," said Robb quietly, blinking in shock, "this ought to be interesting."